And then this is the kind of noob trap setup killer. If we try to come this way, the boulder comes crashing through, and then you just fight a bunch of Cabra demons. Check. All right, there we go. That's what I get for unplugging my mic and dealing with stream stuff offline. So anyway, hope you're all doing well. It's nice to have so many of you in this early. True connoisseur, Troy the catfish without horns. Funny thing is, like that little goofy looking heart icon kind of reminds me of that like big red hairy monster that like scared the hell out of Bugs Bunny in Looney Tunes. I don't know why, it's just like the shape of it, I guess. Scaleezy, nice to see you. Mr. Yada, Errant Vice, Astinex, Vacuo Zealot, Methoda. Scaleezy posted a picture of the cat in general chat. Uh-oh, we gotta look at that real quick. Ghostly incandescent indeed, holy crap. Let me copy this here so everyone else can enjoy the gross incandescence of your cat. It's too late. Like the little toy. Thank you for the cat pic. I appreciate that. Um Boulder Cam, let's go. He's glowing. Mercy, welcome in. You just keep using Nair, you can't help yourself. Yada upgraded their bed from a double to queen. Feels good. Nice. It turns out this year I've kind of gifted a lot of bedding, I guess, for like the holidays and stuff. Pillows, they make for surprisingly thoughtful gifts, especially if you get like the customizable kind, because then whoever receives it can use it to their liking, and then it's all good. So yeah, that's a pro gift idea from me to you. All right. So yesterday we watched a decent amount of videos. Why does this always get stuck? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. So we started off with the top 10 times From Software trolled us by Trey Irby. Then Sekiro is the best FromSoft game by Just Jorge. And funnily enough, both of these folks replied to me in my messages. So that's pretty nice. They were both appreciative of the reaction and the comments and everything. So that was really cool. Then we watched Elden Ring Lore, Why Did the Carian Queen Grieve by Jack is a Mimic, who also was interacting with us more on the Discord today. And then we finished off with Bandit Games, Queen America's Full Story Explained, which had some really interesting ideas that I, disagreed with, but it was a very interesting video nonetheless. So today we will be going into some more of the Renala and Carian lore with a long video by Smotown, because I don't think this guy makes short videos. But anyway, after that, depending on how much time we have left, we will watch Why Does Dark Souls Sound Like Dark Souls? So, pretty excited for both these videos. Hope you guys are as well. It's a very good cat pick indeed. What if you got someone a revolver with mini marshmallows in the chamber? I don't know if that's TOS or not, but yeah, that sounds like a very interesting idea. And also, welcome back to the stream, Warlord. All right, so let's go ahead and dive on into our first video of the day with Elden Ring lore, Rennala, and the Carian Royals. But before I actually go into that, before I forget, I did manage to get all of the hardware necessary for me to capture footage from my PS TV, so I'll be able to stream Alundra in the very near future. I still need to work out some kinks and bugs in the whole like stream setup, so maybe by Friday I will start streaming that as well, or on its own. I'm still trying to determine exactly how I want to go through that. So kind of just stand by for further information on that one. So, okay. Now we will go into our first video with Elden Ring lore, Renala, and the Carian Royals by Smotown. Spoiler warning.
The lands between are dominated
I'm pressing the wrong button. I'm like, how come the captions aren't showing up? I need to not press X. I need to press C.
by the Erd Tree and its god queen Marika in most recent times.
And I'll turn up the
Marika
volume
and
for you
her
guys a
royal
little bit.
family
Let me
had
know how it
wrested
is.
control of the lands between through military might, culminating in the massacre of the Fire Giants and the containment of their ruinous flame. However, there were one people that the Erd Tree forces were never able to overcome, not through strength of arm at least. And I am of course referring to the Kingdom of Liurnia, led by the powerful Carian Royal Family. In the end,
Hey, Crunchy, nice to see you in chat again. Spoilers, Radagon is America? No! No! You ruined it for everyone. Scowlies says, why was Radagon considered a Carian Royal by... Or so was Radagon considered a Carian Royal by marriage? Or was he not involved in regal stuff? So I don't remember if... I do think it's one of the Carian descriptions which describes him as like... Or maybe it's the America stuff. Where it sounds like he marries into the family, so like Renala is still the matriarch and he's second fiddle to her. Well, I mean he kind of wears the pants in the relationship, I guess, but at least politically he's kind of a step below her, it seems.
these two houses would join via the marriage of Radagon and Renala, producing some of the most powerful demigods of an age. Yet the truce of the Erd Tree house and the marriage of Radagon and Renala is just the tail end of their story. When we examine the Carians, we can see there's an august history of a fascinating family that transformed the power dynamics of Liurnia and the greater lands between. So in this lore video, we will be examining the story of the Carian dynasty from astrologer roots to lunar monarchy and its eventual collapse. And at this stage I would like to thank Loki, translator and author of Abyssal Archive, for providing their translations and insights throughout, which I will reference. But before we get started, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, as I have hours and hours of lore content for you to enjoy.
Speaking of hours and hours of lore content, I know Smotown has recently been compiling all of his videos into 2 parts, and he's got like 25 hours combined total of Elden Ring content, which is just absolutely monstrous, all things considered. Eblog, welcome into the stream. You're at the cleansing idol, and you wonder if it's possible to cleanse oneself of ligma disease? Well, not at the cleansing idol. First, you need to go to the gargoyle, and gargoyle these nuts. So, yeah.
The story of the Carian starts where most of Magic's story in the lands between begin, on the mountain tops of the Giants, where a fledgling society of astrologers first lived in years past. Renala is referred to as an astrologer in the Stargazer heirloom, which is how we know that she is descended from them. Chronologically, we first hear of the existence of these astrologers via the Sword of Night and Flame, a relic of the Carians, which reads as follows: Storied sword and treasure of Caria Manor. Astrologers who preceded the sorcerers established themselves in the mountaintops that nearly touched the sky, and considered the fire giants their neighbours. Notably, this sword is also described as a treasure of the Carians, and it's found in Caria Manor, reinforcing the fact that they do owe their lineage to these early astrologers and they honour it, a fact reinforced by the description of the preceptor set as well. We find evidence of this old society in the stone basins and the Stargazer ruins found on the mountaintops, the latter of which was presumably their home. Going by the account given in the sword, these astrologers...
Yeah, and I should double check like the actual place location names, but as far as like the term astrologer goes in the Japanese, it's essentially like Star Watcher or Stargazer. So it makes sense that the Stargazer ruins would be related to the astrologers, although, like I said, I should double check that.
lived peacefully in the mountains alongside the fire giants, meaning the development of this proto-Liurnian society very much predates the Erd Tree dominion. I presume most are aware of this, but for those who aren't, these early stargazers are the ancestors to the glintstone sorcerers, as is said in the sword description we just read, but it's also reinforced via the Carian Preceptor set, which reads the following. A long, bright blue gown with the movements of the stars drawn upon it, worn by the magic preceptors who served the Carian Royals. Glintstone sorcerers are the descendants of astrologers, a fact that the Carians remain aware of, even if their fate has long been severed from the stars.
Yeah, so I just looked at both the location name and the Stargazer heirloom. That's what showed up first. But anyway, this isn't like too important, but I don't know. Sometimes it's just kind of nice and fun to share this kind of stuff. So in the English, it says like the young astrologer gazed at the night sky, blah, blah, blah. So astrologer right here comes from these two characters. So Sei and then Ken, essentially. Just kind of funny because it reminds me of like Sei Ken no Desensu, like Legend, not Legend of Mana, but like the Sword of Mana. Anyway, so we have Star Viewer or Stargazer, which is obviously where you get Stargazer heirloom from. So it's kind of interesting that it's just not consistent, and I'm a little bit curious as to why. Maybe they thought it could have just sounded a little bit too redundant to say the Stargazer or the young the young Stargazer gazed. Oh yeah, that'd be kind of awkward. But I mean, they could have just like reformatted that. So like the young Stargazer looked at the night sky. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, it's not too important, but I thought you guys might like that. Aaron Vice asks, if the astrologers were cool with the fire giants, why is there a link between intelligence and frost, the thing that opposed the fire giants? So, I mean, the astrologers themselves weren't necessarily the fire giants, so it could make sense that they could have lived at least in harmony or at least peace with each other. And there is the odd thing to consider with the trolls like swearing vows to the Carians at least. And it is curious how far back those ties go, because presumably some of the trolls should have been fighting with the Carians against the Erdtree forces, who also should have presumably had trolls who betrayed the fire giants. So yeah, the trolls in general, I think, are very interesting, but there's just so little to go with them, which, I mean, in a lot of ways, it does make a lot of sense, because the trolls are, can you even really call them second-class citizens? Because I kind of doubt they even have citizenship in some cases, but I think you guys get what I mean with that. Unless frost magic in a contemporary sense is related to the moon and not the Zamor's frost. So I don't necessarily think like all forms of frost are antithetical to the fire giants, but yeah, it is a good question to bring up, like the relationship between frost and everything, because you do have the Zamorians and their perceived animosity towards the fire giants and whatnot. So Scowleezy says frost sorceries are related to intelligence. Who knows if cold incantations are possible? It might be possible. I mean, in a certain sense, like, if you have a high enough level of faith, presumably anything is possible with, within reason to a degree. But yeah, maybe we'll get some more of that with the DLC. I feel like we should have maybe the DLC will fix it counter for each stream at this point. Vacuous Zealot feels bad for Topes. He discovered a whole new school of sorcery and found out that sorcery and incantations have a common origin. Hey, howdy, welcome in. You saw the reaction? You think Radagon being a living great rune sounds really realistic? It makes sense, and you're on that theory? I don't necessarily think so, because I don't think that rune existed until he went to Raya Lucaria and got the inspiration to create it. But, that's just my perspective. Okay, going back to the video.
It is very interesting to me that the Carians do have this habit of remembering and lauding their ancestry, no doubt a practice enforced by Renala, who herself was an astrologer. And of course, recording and preserving one's lineage is important for monarchies in the real world as well. Of course, the other reason the Carians still likely care about astrology is that they are fully aware of how important fate is, especially to them.
The stars alter the fate of the Carian Royal Family, and the fate of your mistress, Ranni.
My understanding of the settlement of Liurnia and Rhea Lucaria is that Rhea Lucaria predates the rise of the Carians as a royal family, and they developed independently of one another. I mean,
Yes, I would agree with that because we have Lusat and Azur who founded the earliest conspectuses. I never actually remember who was the first one to do it, so I just kind of lumped them together. But anyway.
only take this from the specific wording of her remembrance, which reads the following. In her youth, Renala was a prominent champion who charmed the academy with her lunar magic, becoming its master. She also led the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty. The fact she made this discovery in her youth and then charmed the academy reinforces the idea that the Rhea Lucarian Academy was already an established facility by the time Renala came to prominence. And indeed momentarily we will examine the history of Rhea Lucaria, which predates the rise of Caria, when we look at founding OG members like Lusat and Azur. But returning to the Carian preceptor set, the Astrologers are the ancestors of those who would become glintstone sorcerers, the sorcerers we find in Rhea Lucaria. And so we do have to fill in the gap a little bit when it comes to the transition from this astrologer society on the mountain to the glintstone sorcerers of the Liurnian basin. However, it is clear that in time the descendants of astrologers moved from the study of the sky to the study of glintstone, a material which makes one's position relative to the sky less of a pressing issue. Indeed, if you take a look at Liurnia's landscape, we can see that it is a huge source of glintstone, both above ground and beneath it, and thus it makes sense that these adherents of the stars would gravitate towards this region. Indeed, even now, a glintstone mine lies underneath Rhea Lucaria, in the form of the Academy Crystal Cave, and as we learn from the Shatter Earth sorcery description, glintstone mining is very central to their culture. It is the foundation of it, with the failures of the Academy still being useful to that ecosystem by doing the dangerous job of mining glintstone that can be studied by.
I'm not sure I'm actually getting quite that strong of a reading of that. So I kind of want to just like listen to that again. Because maybe there's another description which like hints at that a bit more. And certainly like they, glintstone is definitely mined by a lot of people, but I'm just, want to double check. All right.
In the form of the Academy Crystal Cave, and as we learn from the Shatter Earth sorcery description, glintstone mining is very central to their culture. It is the foundation of it, with the failures of the Academy still being useful to that ecosystem by doing the dangerous job of mining glintstone that can be studied by their betters. And while the glintstone sorcerers are
So yeah, I do think that is a little bit of headcanon. I think it's pretty plausible though, but it would have been nice if there's like a little bit more of a disclaimer or a little bit more language used to kind of reflect that a bit more clearly there.
Are the descendants of astrologers, there has to be some overlap. The astrologers didn't completely cease to be, although their community on the mountaintops does seem to have been a thing of the past. As I said earlier, it seems that Renala was still part of an astrologer community, even after Rhea Lucaria must have been established, because in her youth she meets her moon, and then not long after she goes to the academy and charms it. Renala's early history as part of this astrologer community, and her meeting the moon that would change her life, is best explored by the item Stargazer Heirloom, which reads the following. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. The obvious conclusion that we have to come to then, with this overlap, is that Renala's community was either the last to come down from the mountaintops, or was simply the last to give up that way of life, whilst others had long become glintstone sorcerers. Loki had
And I think one important thing to consider with that is the telescope's description, in which it talks about how Carian astrology withered on the vine, more or less because of being fettered by the Golden Order. So even if they wanted to, it is questionable how much they really could have continued that kind of lifestyle up on the mountaintops. And then there is also the very big question of how different the landscape may have been before the Shattering and or before the war against the Fire Giants, because as a couple of you have pointed out in chat, like there's a good possibility Liurnia could have been more mountainous. It's kind of like sinking into the lakes and stuff now. But beyond that, I've thought for a very long time that there's a strong possibility that something like parts of Liurnia or the Shifra slash, well, really like the Shifra River area and bits of Caelid seem like they should be more directly related than they currently are. And I've wondered whether or not rearranging the Elden Ring, either when Godfrey became Elden Lord, when Radagon became Elden Lord, and or after the Shattering, could have impacted the essential like surface landmass of the lands between and created some like continental shifts. So that way the landscape as we know it today could have been drastically different from the pre-Shattering era and or even like the Godfrey era. And that idea might also tie into the Shadow of the Erd Tree teaser portrait as well, because if the Erd Tree as we know it is being depicted in that picture, it certainly doesn't line up with any of the landscape of the Erd Tree as we can see it now. So obviously many people tend to believe that because the landscape of that shadowy Erd Tree figure doesn't align with what we get in the game, that it may be a different location, whether or not that means something more like the Dreamlands or an Erd Tree that's kind of like hinted at through the Elden Beasts arena. We don't really know because we don't know a damn thing about the DLC yet. So yeah, those are just kind of some of the possibilities that I think are worth consideration here. And yeah, just with the Carian astrology withering on the vine, I do think Smo brings up a pretty good point that Renala would have been one of, if not like the last astrologer to come down, but we don't really know. Yeah, Vacuous Zealot said, it said Liurnia was known for its vast forests and ever-present fog, which reminds me that the fog in Liurnia is most likely supposed to be due to the glintstone creating a quote-unquote glintstone eventide, which essentially just means like a false glintstone night, depending on how one interprets the words of the Northwest Limgrave finger reader crone. Because in Japanese, it's a little bit clearer that glintstone equals false night. And so in order to traverse Raya Lucaria, she's more or less telling you to overcome Raya Lucaria and its false night. So yeah. Scalezi said, the primal glintstone thing should have had a larger presence in Carian culture. Like the family takes your primal glintstone and adds it to the family shrine so you can have peace with the ancestors. That's a really interesting idea. And that might also tie into things like the puppets in Raya Lucaria. They could have been imbued with primal glintstones for all we know. That's one of the parts of their culture which has really fascinated me and just has very little exposition on it whatsoever. So, hey, I-Man, welcome back to the stream. And good morning to you. Although it's definitely a little bit past evening for me. Alright, going back to the video.
Has an interesting perspective on this gradual migration from the mountaintops, something shown by this map here. Loki believes that we can trace the migration pattern of the astrologers through the trees. The suggestion being that each migration of astrologers brought large conifers with them to their new home. We can see these ghost conifers on the mountaintops of the giants, the astrologers' original home. We can also see dead ones at Lascar Ruins in South Liurnia, where they clearly migrated to, and in Celia, and of course Moonlight Altar, where the Carians would eventually migrate to. We can also find them in the area around the Shifra River, and in the Hallowhorn grounds which lie above the Shifra River. Given that both of these areas surround the city of Nokron, Loki suggests that the conifer's presence here is because of a contact between Celia and Nokron, which we of course know exist, given Celia's deep ties to the Eternal City. and the Nox. My main issue with this is that I personally see Celia as more culturally Nox or Numen, though I believe Loki isn't discounting this either. Rather, Loki sees the town of Celia as the result of a sort of cross-pollination, that astrologers settled down here in Caelid and made contact with the Nox. And while the establishment of Celia above ground...
And part of the reason why I brought up the shifting landscapes is because there are some similarities between the locations that doesn't make a ton of sense from the very little that we know of the lands between, in that we have gigantic skeletons embedded into the ground of Caelid and the Forbidden Lands and the mountaintops of the Giants. So I do think it is a strong possibility that Caelid could have been more directly connected to the mountaintops at one point, and or Liurnia, because I've wondered whether or not there's like a kind of Pangea type effect going on where all of the continents were kind of like more interconnected and they kind of got broken up more due to the shattering or some other events or just, the passage of time. Yeah, Hunter Man plays Pokemans. You can fall asleep to this. Yeah. I know I have a dulcet voice, as many people say, so I will not blame you. Why Papa Gaspelon have rune? That's a funny question. Probably just because like runes are the most basic power unit currency. So probably anything animate may have runes to some degree.
Is definitely because of the Noxian influence. He believes that the population here are mainly astrologer descendants. And I do think this certainly makes sense given that we only see 2 true Nox in this town, and the rest appear like normal glintstone sorcerers. But I really like this theory of Loki regarding the conifers and the migration patterns of the astrologers, and I think it helps illustrate the evolution of the astrologer community to their...
And yeah, I generally don't believe that the astrologers would have like planted their conifers specifically. That could have like predated people for all we know. But with that being said, I do generally agree with the idea that I think the conifers are meant to be older than the deciduous trees. And for anybody who might not know those terms like super specifically, a conifer is a tree that's kind of like a pine tree, just for simplicity's sake. And a deciduous tree is kind of like a more generic looking tree that where it's like leaves fall off and everything like that. It's 4:30 a.m. there? Oh man, you should definitely fall asleep. Caelid puppets don't fly balloons? Yeah. Vice will say that the continents of the lands between do increase in height radially. You have sand beaches and Limgrave, but it's sheer cliffs in all other lands. And we actually have seen kind of, well, some evidence that shows that the lands have shifted quite a bit or were developed a lot more over time, depending on how accurate you feel some of the paintings in Castle Stormvale are. I guess I should like pull up the photo. Give me a second. Painting. Okay, this will be good enough. So this is a painting that you can see in Castle Stormvale. I think this one is from like the official art book, so it's a lot higher quality. And so this is supposed to be where Stormvale is. It doesn't really match what you see in game. I actually took a bunch of screenshots of it too. Let me think about it. What did I label that? Stormvale painting? I think that's in the other folder. Zoink Scoob. Stormvale. Maybe I just have it labeled differently, or maybe I'm just being a little too impatient with my scanning. this stuff. No, that's not it. Maybe it was in the original folder after all. Oh, wait, no, I definitely have it. Okay, they just don't look like it from my little screenshots. Okay, that's a really bad one because it's Erd Tree Burning Time. Okay, so this one isn't too bad because you can see from right there you have like the Divine Tower, but that really does not match up with what we see very well. So like I was like, is this more of an angle thing? Is it an FOV thing? But it's no matter how you really try to position the camera, it just doesn't quite work. So that one's, better. But just like the angle of this should suggest that like this camera should be a lot further to the left, so that way the length of the bridge is shortened here, which, I mean, this is just like concept art, doesn't really matter, but just to show that if this painting exists in the world, is this supposed to be like a painting from a specific time? And is this how part of the lands between looked at one point? Obviously, Stormvale Castle isn't here itself, and this doesn't really align with anything else. So here is the same kind of vantage, but a little bit better, a little bit brighter. So we've got Stormvale like spanning the two broken things. So like that just does not match up at all. So anyway, just wanted to bring that up because it's really fascinated and bothered me at the same time. It's 5:30 by Iman. Plastic Replica, welcome on in. Is that Griffith?
Glintstone descendants, via conifers that are primarily found on the mountaintops of the giants, but also these conifers are found in areas related to glintstone sorcery, such as Moonlight Altar, Lascar Ruins, and Celia. But to conclude, whilst a lot of her astrologer kin had already become glintstone sorcerers, Renala was still part of the astrologer tradition. But once again, I think Loki puts it in a more concise way, and so once again I will quote Loki's notes to me on this subject. The Carians are still living on the mountaintops during Renala's youth and migrate down while she is still relatively young. The Lascar and Celia already have a lengthy history, with the academy under Azur and Lusat. In short, they establish themselves as nobles on the western mountain and become royalty within a short number of years. But the power dynamic would shift when she met this cosmic entity, the full moon, that would come to define her and her rule henceforth.
Anyone else feeling a little coniferous right now?
Stargazer heirloom, as a young astrologer, Renala was essentially observing the stars, and at this point she made contact with the moon. Where this fateful meeting took place, for me, is most likely to be Moonlight Altar, mainly because the location has a deep connection to the moon specifically. Despite this altar not being the highest point in the lands between, one is able to see the moon far more clearly than in any location. A place where we can see the full moon and the dark moon in the sky simultaneously, unlike in other areas of the map, even just below us, in Liurnia, which means it most likely has a special connection to the moon. And if this was where Renala first made contact, it would make sense that this is where a Moonlight Altar would be established. We learn that Renala tries to recreate her own meeting with her moon with her daughter Ranni, and this is something we...
So since Iman asked it, I figured others might wonder as well. A conifer is a specific type of tree, and they all seem to have cones. There might be something more to it. I'm not really a botanist. So rather than fruit, which is what you would get on a deciduous tree, conifers have like cones. So typically if you think of something more like a pine tree, that would kind of work. I guess like a Hixius, definitely not. But anyway, cedar. Oh, interesting. So yeah, the redwoods and whatnot are also pine trees, or not pine trees, conifers.
We learn of via Ranni's dark moon, which reads as follows. This moon was encountered by a young Ranni, led by the hand of her mother, Renala. What she beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. Given that the full moon is foundational to Renala's power, and she sees Ranni as her heir, this makes total sense. But returning to Moonlight Altar, given it is one of the only places in the lands between that we can see the dark moon and the full moon in the sky simultaneously, it does lead me to believe that this is where Renala led Ranni to meet her own moon, and it is where originally Renala met her moon. With that in mind, let us consider the archaeology of Moonlight Altar and what it can tell us about the early history of the Carians. First,
So yeah, I don't know if Renala would have necessarily met her moon here specifically. I do think there is a good argument to suggest that it could have been by the Stargazer heirloom, because you have the painter dude who gives you the Great Hood description, which could make it seem as though that's where it happened. But to be fair, it is ambiguous, so this isn't like something that I would completely disagree with. It's just one of those things where I just don't really know either way.
Firstly, there are two sets of ruins that can be found on the altar in the shadow of the cathedral, the Lunar Estate and the Moonfolk ruins. As I stated in my Hidden Tales video, I attribute the Lunar Estate to be the estate of the Carian family, prior to them living in Caria Manor. The term estate in the real world, in Britain, is usually used to denote land owned by a royal or aristocratic family, and so I see this as the old Carian estate, the Lunar Estate. The Stargazer heirloom states that in time Renala became a queen, and given she was very young when she met the moon, it is a reasonable assumption that a good deal of time passed between her meeting the full moon and establishing the Carians as a royal family. She would attend the Rennala the Carian.
Yeah, so I just looked at the Japanese, just because I'm curious now with the whole like estate thing. So Lunar Estate Ruins is there, and the Japanese here is like ruins of the clan, or sorry, ruins of the like lunar nobles essentially. So I think estate is a pretty good localization there to get that idea across. And then the moon folk ruins, I mean, folk is a really good way to translate like mean, which kind of can mean like a folk, a people, or like a clan. So yeah, I think these are pretty good localizations there.
Caria Academy as a young sorceress, charm them with her unique magic, and then in time build up her power base, before eventually declaring herself as monarchy, when she had enough power, of course. And the foundation of that power, I think, can be found here in the Moonlight Altar. And as such, I would imagine this lunar estate to be her family's home during this transitionary period, established at the site of the most important meeting of her life. Likewise, I would see the Moonfolk ruins as the ruins of a community who followed Renala and joined her in the veneration of the moon. There is another feature of interest to this story found on Moonlight Altar, and this is what I call the Three Sister statues, which are guarded by a Red Wolf of Radagon. Now, we are never directly told what these statues represent, but the statues of the three female figures immediately makes me think of the Three Sisters found at Caria Manor. These towers are called Rennala, Ranni, and Selvus's Rise. Selvus's Rise is clearly named after the current occupant. However, given this area is called the Three Sisters, I speculate that this is only a recent renaming of the tower, and that at one stage it was also named after a female. Therefore, speculatively, there might have been three sisters, of which Ranni was just one, multiple Carian princesses. Indeed, the description of the Carian filigreed crest...
It's funny because I literally hesitated at pausing the video to bring this up, because I feel like I've just been doing that constantly over the past couple days on stream.
does imply there were multiple Carian princesses. And while it is speculation, I do think this is the story that is being told to us through the environmental details, and is just another tie to the Carians, suggesting that this was their earlier home, predating Caria Manor. Then of course we have the Cathedral, the Manus Celeste itself, and as Ziostorm points out in his video on Moonlight Altar, this cathedral shares the same architectural design as the Church of Vows, marking it as a Carian structure, really being the final piece of evidence.
And if I remember correctly, Zoli or Garden Advise may have shown that this was originally intended to be like placed in Caelid by the Dragon Cathedral over there. and or like it's essentially like a copy paste type thing. So yeah, I don't exactly know what to make of all of these churches. I do think that they tend to predate the reign of America, and that the churches of America would have retrofitted these kind of churches for their needs, with a few exceptions. But yeah, okay. Hey, Cantrell, welcome back in. Who fathered those children? It's a good question. So some people think that it's possible that Renala could have had a consort before Radagon, and others don't think that. And to be fair, we're never given an actual total number of the children that Marika or Radagon have ever had. So it's all up in the air. Omega sign or horseshoe?
Evidence that Moonlight Altar is Carian. The translation of the Latin Mana Celeste that people have provided within the community does vary, but the two most likely translations are the Hand of God or Hidden Hand. The cathedral itself is shattered, and spread throughout the ruined fragments of the cathedral are starlight shards. Additionally, in the sky we can see blue streaks, suggesting that starfall has damaged the cathedral here, and this is something suggested by Ziostorm. And while I agree that the cathedral itself was damaged by a starfall, I don't agree with the common notion that the two fingers found beneath the cathedral came down as a sort of meteor, and people usually cite the different blue colorization of these fingers and the blue streaks in the sky as evidence for this. One of my main reasons for not agreeing.
That's interesting. Yeah, the way that I look at the blue streaks in the Moonlight Plateau, or the Moonlight Altar, whatever it's called, is that they're kind of supposed to be a thematic juxtaposition of the types of pillars of light that the Erd Tree creates. So if the Erd Tree can create, pillars of light, and the Dark Moon can create pillars of light, I think that's just meant to show that either can become like viable means of instantiating order or something like that. I don't know. Hand of God from Liza P. No spoilers. Oh no, I've been spoiled, guys. Cantrell says, it makes sense America would have a consort considering her status. It would be serious matriarchy if just the thing royal women did in these lands. You don't see that from male rulers, if there are. You don't think there are there? So with the you're asking if there are male like rulers in the lands between who like have children? Not like literally, like they don't necessarily get pregnant. So there are cases of some, potential male lords in the past, depending on how you feel about Placidusax, Sarash, and or the Stormhawk King. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, generally speaking, it does seem that there's more of a matriarchy in the lands between, partially because of America's reign and just kind of in general. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff is arguable because Godfrey definitely represents a lot of the quote unquote traditional patriarchy by essentially gaining the right to have a family and a kingdom and all that stuff through strength, which is, a very masculine style trait. And Godfrey in general is just a huge symbol of a return to the past, which is kind of like a return to traditionalism, I guess. So yeah, I don't know, but it is annoying because sometimes it seems like America has so much agency that she's literally controlling everyone in the lands between, and it's extremely frustrating. And then other times it seems she has so little agency that she's just little more than a doll, I guess, pun intended, when you compare her to Ranni. So yeah, it's just kind of all over the place. And this isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It's just it feels like how I often describe these games and their lore, kind of like the Rorschach test, where you can kind of get out of it what you like think you see, and everyone can look at the exact same thing and come to a different conclusion, essentially.
With it, and again this is pointed out by Ziostorm in his video, is that the crater or channel that leads down to the two fingers is not a straight up and down line.
Yeah, I agree with that. But then, who done said it? Oh yeah, Errant Vice said Godfrey wasn't the king of the land; he was the consort of the ruler, as is Radagon. So the difference between like Godfrey and Radagon is Godfrey kind of established order by being a conqueror. So even if he was kind of second fiddle status wise to Marika, that's because she was just kind of more pedestalized than he was. And you could argue that the only reason that the Erdtree's forces grew as much as they did was because of Godfrey. And so he is kind of more of a warring king than a ruling king, which is kind of against like the whole idea of like culture and stuff, which kind of like ties into the thematics between Godfrey's banishment and Radagon's creation of order in such a way where they kind of like look down on the barbarism of the past, I guess. But yeah, I do think that's a fair question, though.
The passage that leads to the two fingers under here actually travels horizontally a fair bit, and so if it was a straight meteor site, you'd think it would just be a straight up and down channel. And more importantly, I think the name of the cathedral, the Hand of God or Hidden Hand, is actually named after the two fingers, meaning it is built after the two fingers arrived here. And this would discount the notion that the two fingers sort of crashed through the roof of the cathedral, because I don't think.
Yeah, so I guess they're trying to say that Celeste could mean God. The way that I've always interpreted it, and I don't know Latin for anything, so take this with a heavy grain of salt, is that it's more like the cathedral of the heavenly hand, with heavenly coming from Celeste as in celestial, rather than a more of like a reference to divinity. Although there's obviously a decent amount of overlap between the idea of the celestial and I don't want to say God in this context, but of the divine. But yeah, I don't know.
It would have been built until after the two fingers had appeared. So if the cathedral was built in honour of the two fingers, as I'm suggesting, this really clashes with Ranni's future view of the two fingers and the greater will. Ranni would later come to despise her connection to the fingers, but perhaps at the time it was a cause of celebration for the Carians. After all, their heir, their princess, had just been granted Empyrean status. There is one other fact of importance that is relevant when discussing Moonlight Altar and this early community of the Carians, and that is the connection to the Eternal Cities, specifically Noxtella. The passageway that now acts as the den of the fearsome Astel is sealed with the seal of the Carians, marking it as their passageway, and this passageway ultimately acts as an underground highway to Noxtella. And this makes sense because the Eternals and the Carians do have some cultural overlaps, most overtly seen in the Church of Vows. This church literally houses statues that can also be found in the Eternal Cities. But more importantly, the actual main function of this church is the basin, and this is actually a statue of a Noxian swordstress, and it requires you to use celestial dew. And as the description of the celestial dew tells us,
the dew spelled with DU is just kind of getting at me for whatever reason. So Iman and True Connoisseur seem to know a bit of Latin, and True Connoisseur says, we're all guessing at the team's intent depending on how we read what we think they grammatically meant. Yeah, so it's a good old game of telephone, it seems. But yeah, if you guys do have a little bit more context about what you think Manus Celeste means, I will be interested in hearing it.
Celestial dew. And as the description of the celestial dew tells us, this is an invention of the Nox. And so this absolutely speaks to contact between the Carians and the Nox, and is a nice detail when looking at their cultural and ideological development, as the tunnels at Moonlight Altar that lead to the Eternal Cities speak to this sort of contact. So to summarise, I see the Moonlight Altar as the first bastion of Carian influence, when they were more concerned with the power of the moon, and before they became associated with Erdtree royalty. As for why they abandoned this significant location, well, there are a couple of speculative ideas that I have. Firstly, there's the possibility that this region became less significant and more isolated as the land in Liurnia fell away. After all, we're only able to actually access this area by passing through the Eternal Cities. There's no direct route for Liurnia, and as someone who is the monarch of Liurnia, basing yourself in a location that can't even access the lands that you rule is really not a strategic advantage. And so perhaps when the lands fell away and the Lake of Liurnia was created, the Carians looked for a new location from which to rule from. It could also be a shift in priorities. When she got married to Radagon and they had children together, and her alliance with the Erdtree family obviously strengthened, perhaps she was less concerned with her old ways of venerating the moon, and she cared more about maintaining her alliance and her marriage. And Caria Manor's location is definitely closer to Altus Plateau, and if there was an ongoing alliance between these two houses, it would make sense to relocate somewhere closer to Altus Plateau.
And I also think it's highly worth noting that on Caria Manor, you have depictions of the Erdtree like on their ramparts and stuff. And so, why the hell would the Carians have the relief of the Erdtree sculpted into their manor if they were still currently at war or not completely part of the Erdtree Empire? It doesn't make sense in any way except for this place to have been built after the fact, which is kind of funny because I think pretty much this spot in Altus Plateau might have like the oldest version of the conifers here, but I guess that's not like really too important. So True Connoisseur thinks it's likely they meant to suggest Celestial Hand, although Hidden Hand is possible. Okay. Heavenly Hand, Celeste is heaven. Sky or ceiling of the world. Okay. Thank you.
It would make sense to relocate somewhere closer to Altus Plateau. So while we've discussed Rennala's consolidation of a power base, we also need to talk about her influence in another area, and this is of course in Rennala the Carian, a institution that she would come to dominate, and is definitely one of the pillars of her rule. So let's talk about that. As we've already mentioned, Renala was able to charm people at the Rennala the Carian Academy because of her unique magic, and when you look at the history of sorcery in the lands between, this certainly makes sense, because Rennala's moon magic would have been like nothing anyone had seen before. The Lazuli Conspectus mask, which represents the school that was founded to study Carian magic, shines a light on this, as it reads, "Scholars of the Lazuli Conspectus study Carian sorceries, a heterodox pursuit that views the moon as equal to the stars." So this means that moon magic is unorthodox, and it was no doubt this unique nature that led to Rennala becoming so prominent to the stage where she is honoured in paintings, alongside other alumni. It's not just the uniqueness of her magic though, Rennala is of course a very competent sorceress in other regards. A point well made by Loki in his notes to me is that Rennala in stage 2 of her fight with us, which is presumably Ranni recreating her glory days, she is able to use Azur's Comet, showing that while she eventually banned the primeval sorcerers from the academy, she was certainly capable of using their most powerful spells. And so with the combination of her raw talent and this unique type of sorcery that clearly blew away the academy and revolutionised its way of thinking, it's no surprise that she would become governess of the academy.
Yeah, and that's something that I agree with, that I think she obviously studied primal glintstone sorcery, or whatever it's called, to a degree, and I think she must have been the one to have banned Lusat and Azur for whatever reason. We don't exactly know.
Fact we can learn from Miriel, who names her as such. Renala and her brand of Carian magic eventually claiming dominance over the academy had quite a few consequences. Firstly, of course, it is definitely a huge win for her. It is a consolidation of power, and no doubt helped her legitimacy when she established herself as royalty. And we will learn about other things that she did to consolidate her power base in the next chapter, when we look at her forces and allies. But of course, claiming dominance over the Academy is a massive feather in her cap. But of course, it would gain her enemies, as there must have been...
It's kind of ironic to say a feather in her cap, because her cap kind of looks like a bird, depending on the angle.
...an existing power structure in the Academy before Rennala took full control. Because while Renala became the sole governor or ruler of Rennala the Carian, it seems that before her, there were Grand Masters, a term coined in the robes of Azur and Lusat, two sorcerers that she would ultimately oust. It is of course Renala who dismantled the power base of those known as the primeval sorcerers, something we can learn via Selin's personal enmity of the Carians.
If you recall, I was exiled from the Academy of Rennala the Carian. It was for attempting to restore the primeval current of glintstone sorcery. The toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian Royal Family can rot for all I care.
Is it bad that when I see this kind of footage, I'm like, oh, Smotown must have captured this pretty early, because it also has like the normal BGM in the background and it's not free cam. It's just kind of like what immediately comes to mind. Hey Mortis, it's going pretty well. How about you? Methoda says, before Renala found her moon, was there just no moon in the sky, or could everyone always see it, but the moon just wasn't respected? So I think there's a couple things that like tie into it. I think the moon that Renala conjures isn't like the exact same moon as the moon in the sky. Maybe, we don't really know, of course, but I think the reason it moved the Rayulukarians so much is that her moon was able to guide the stars, and in a sense, most of the scholarship of those Rayulukarians would have been devoted to the study of the stars as kind of a pseudo-astrologers, because glintstones sorcerers are descended from astrologers, and there are still some of the Rayulukarian conspectuses which are related to star viewing specifically, or like comets and stuff. I don't remember. That's kind of like one of the parts of the lore that I just tend to forget which is which quite often, because it's just kind of really easy to lump them all together, all those damned glintstone sorcerers. You started Elden Ring on the Steam Deck. For some reason, it runs well. Valve Tech or something. So I think they probably wanted to make sure it ran well, and they probably like optimized that game because it would be a huge selling point for the Steam Deck. It's more likely they were referencing the sky with Mana Celeste, since Celeste is a rare form of Celery. Romans actually believed that the sky is kind of a bowl put over the earth. Yeah, true. It does have the green check mark? Okay. So what was I saying right before this? I can't recall. Right, before Renala found the moon. Okay, yeah. So with Renala being able to conjure lunar magic, which was able to guide the stars, I think if you take that kind of figurative language at face value, if Renala is able to guide the stars and all of these people are studying the stars, and if, you know, they're following the stars, she's kind of able to guide them as well, essentially. So whether or not she literally charmed them through magical means, or if they just became naturally enamored with her, is left to interpretation as always. But it's probably a little bit of A and a little bit of B.
I want glintstone sorceries that open our minds, unbound by terrestrial taboos.
Even to this day, the Carians are still trying to wipe out this school of sorcery, because Selin is being hunted by Jiren, a retainer of the Carians, and presumably the one responsible for chaining up her true body in the Witchbane ruins, no doubt intending to return the moment the stars started moving again and she could be killed for good. And while Selin is the most recent heir of this school, she isn't the one that founded this. In fact, this can be traced back to two of the oldest glintstone sorcerers in existence, Lusat and Azur.
I need your help, my apprentice. Master Lusat is another founding glintstone sorcerer. And like Master Azur, he was banished from the academy. Now he languishes in prison somewhere. My apprentice, can you find Master Lusat? With this glintstone key, you should be able to cross the boundary that encloses him. I need him to restore the primeval current of glintstone sorcery. He's nigh a child of the stars. Such is his body now.
Renala's reasons for banishing this school of sorcerers is never explicitly stated. However, as always, we are able to speculate with the evidence given to us. Firstly, the methods used by Selin and her predecessors are extremely dangerous and pretty abhorrent. And this is of course how Selin earned her moniker, Selin the Graven Witch. The term Graven is a reference to the so-called Graven Schools or Graven Mass, a horrifying abomination that we can learn of via the Graven Mass talisman, which reads, "The primeval current is a forbidden tradition of glintstone sorcery. To those who cleave to its teachings, the act of collecting sorcerers to fashion them into seeds of the stars is but another path of scientific inquiry." We can find these horrifying abominations throughout the lands between, tortured beings, and we can even find a dead one in Rennala the Carian itself, in a room where we find Azur's staff, suggesting that he created one within the halls of the academy itself. Imagine bonding humans together into this Frankenstein ball, within the very hall.
It's actually Frankenstein's monster ball. No. My favorite detail about this Graven School Mass is that above it you kind of have a false night sky, which you can see like a couple flecks of like a starry something there. And I do wish they used that effect a bit more readily with glintstone in general at times. The Graven Masses freak you out. Yeah. So that's stuff like this is one of my favorite things about Elden Ring, like the artificer type archetype, and I wish they leaned into it a bit more, because when I first saw like the flaming chariot and the evil what are they called, catacomb chariots and stuff, I was like, hell yeah, these things are cool. And the Iron Virgins, you don't really get a lot of stuff like that with kind of traditional high fantasy, depending on like what genre you're doing, and or at least you don't really get a lot of that in like the video game format if they aren't like an enemy boss or something like that. So I definitely think there's like a ton of room to grow, like with the pseudo marriage between quote unquote like science and magic, to get like this more artificer type stuff in your fantasy settings. Now, I wouldn't say Lovecraftian, but I think there's definitely a lot of room to incorporate like Lovecraftian elements as well as like this artifice stuff together. Just because like, like Estelle, I think is super cool, and he really adds a very nuanced layer of depth into Elden Ring, which is just brilliant because it makes it feel like there's a lot beyond the lands between. That's how you get the Dwemer? Yeah.
Halls of the academy.
I mean, honestly, the first time I was going down to Shifa River, I was like, oh my god, we're going to Blackreach.
Itself. This no doubt would have caused a lot of discord and resentment. Indeed, the dialogue from top suggests that Selin's expulsion from the academy was indeed tied to her graven habits.
Selin was well known. The most promising sorceress in the history of the academy. I followed her at school. But there may as well have been an ocean between us. But Selin was expelled from the academy, accused of unthinkable treatment of certain sorcerers, under the name of the Graven Witch. I still don't believe the accusations. The illustrious Selin would never do such things.
Seems pretty straightforward. However, I do think there is another consequence of exiling these sorcerers, and that is that Renala got rid of some potential political opponents and solidified her control over the academy. Selid describes both Lusat and Azur.
So, in a certain sense, I can see where he's coming from with that, but with what happens at the end of Selin's questline, it does make me a bit more skeptical, just because, like, Rennala's kind of chilling off in a corner until Selin essentially self-destructs, which, I don't know, there's just something very, very funny to me about that kind of sequence of events. Not so much that, like, Selin is affected by her own hubris as much as just, like, Selin's like, oh yeah, I got rid of that Rennala girl, and she's literally just off to the side. Like, she's not even not in the arena. She's just around a bookcase. It's just absolutely hilarious. Absolutely unintentionally hilarious to me.
Azur as founding glintstone sorcerers, heavily implying that these sorcerers are some of the OGs, sorcerers who not only helped found Rennala the Carian, but helped build the foundations of glintstone sorcery itself. Indeed, this seems more or less certain when we consider the Carolus Crown, which names this school as the oldest, and this school was founded by none other than Azur. So we really are talking about the old guard here, legends who helped build the...
Right, old is 3 letters, Azur is 4 letters, Lusat is 5, so the shorter name is the earlier school. Got it. So that might not make a lot of sense. It might sound really stupid, but that's kind of like one of an effective way of like remembering something. Because like the more ridiculous it is, the kind of easier it becomes to stick out in the mind.
Very foundations of the Academy and sorcery in general. To reinforce their prestigious position that they once held, we can look to their robes, which read the following. Since the Grand Masters Azur and Lusat were driven from the Academy, no one has achieved their formerly held rank. So Azur and Lusat were Grand Masters, a position which hasn't been held since they were expelled, and this makes sense if it coincided with Renala taking control as Governor, a position that essentially made the role of Grand Masters worthless, and it changed the control of the Academy from an oligarchy of these OGs to an effective monarchy. Rennala the Carian thus transformed under Renala. Her school of magic, her brand of magic, would become its own conspectus, the Lazuli. Founding your own school is really the mark of being a great sorcerer, and again, the fact that she is able to do this with her own unique brand of sorcery would definitely have helped solidify her claim to governess of the Academy.
And it is just so damn disappointing to me that Topes pulls a Orbeck in Vinheim and just kind of dies at the end of his quest for no real apparent reason other than tradition, I guess. Like, why does he just keel over and die after making his magic? Maybe he dies of a broken heart because he knows he'll never get Selin and he feels like a glintstone. It's just deeply disappointing to me on so many levels. Crunchy says Azur starts with A, which comes before L, and that can work too. Kinmand, welcome back to the stream. You said you did a deep dive on Mana Celeste. Short version, there's no way you can make that be grammatically correct Latin. Long version Celeste only appear twice in all extant texts. Interesting. It only appeared as a verb meaning to let you hide. Okay. So that's probably a typo or rushed translation. It probably means hidden hand or hidden hands. Okay. Interesting. So, yeah, this is like one of those cases where, the Japanese tends to, it's not like the language itself, but like the way it's used by Japanese people tends to be very, Englishy, for like a lack of a better term, where it just seems to be very often machine translated or translated incorrectly into Latin, which I don't exactly know the hows and whys that happens, because I mean I can't exactly translate English or Japanese into Latin. So I think it's just because like it's got like the cool fantasy vibe that they just kind of go with the vibe check, even if it isn't the most technically accurate thing that they can do at times. Mortis says, Selin is someone who's stuck in her way, so what better fate is there for her to become a rock? It doesn't need to be a translation thing anyway. It could just be cool words that sound a bit like Latin words. Yeah, that's just kind of how I feel about it. Generally, at the end of the day, I am a bit of a pragmatist and a realist, and I think like a lot of the lore is really just kind of made up by the community, and really all the considerations that Miyazaki and the team do are primarily centered around what seems cool to them, which I mean it's perfectly fine. And I realize that we're kind of on our own fool's errand, following all these red herrings to make as much sense of the lore that might not fundamentally make sense, which is probably a terrible thing to say for a channel like mine. But I mean, like I said, I do try to keep it real from time to time. Sounds like a Japanese thing to do. They do that in a lot of some of the games you played. Yeah, game and anime titles are proof of this. So yeah, anytime I think of Latin in a game, I always think of the terrible, terrible chorus of One Winged Angel from Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, it's just kind of tradition at this point. And then earlier, Mr. Yada said that they like the characterization of how Topes seems to think that the rumors about Selin are terrible and can't be true, but Selin herself is proud about what she's doing. Yeah. And so there is a slight difference in the localization for the delivery of Topes' line about the illustrious Selin, where he calls her cute instead. So it's a little bit clearer that he must have had some rose tinted glintstone glasses and thinks Selin can do no wrong because he likes her. 40k is just all Latin sounding nonsense. I mean, what isn't at this point?
Selin describes Carian magic as toothless pedantry, a reflection of the fact that under her rule, under Rennala's rule, there was no research into the primeval current, which people like Selin see as the ultimate end goal of glintstone sorcery as a whole, and thus practicing magic without this end goal in mind is toothless. And so with this clash in ideals and the political aspect of it, it is no wonder that Renala would get rid of these sorcerers from the academy.
And sorry to keep pausing so often, but like one of the most vexing things to me is how Renala bans glintstone, sorry, like the primeval current sorcerers from the academy and whatnot for some perceived transgression, but then towards the end of Renala's days, she kind of devotes herself to what Muriel calls a forbidden rite. So is this kind of an instance of the pot calling the kettle black? Although, of course, when Renala could have banished them, she could have been in a more right state of mind than how we end up meeting her in the academy later. I don't know. So anyway, it's just kind of really fascinating to me that there's something potentially worse about the study of the primeval current versus her forbidden rite of reincarnation. And I wonder if part of that is just because there's a strong penchant for those who study the primeval current to lose their minds, with very few exceptions. I think like Willem is kind of really the only exception that I can think of. Because I mean, Lucette and Azur, they become vegetative and then no more more responsive after they give you their spells. Selin, what really needs to be said about that meatball at the end of her quest? So it's really just Willem, I think. In 40k, they have an excuse as it's technically High Gothic and not Latin. Okay.
And with it, her control was secure. I had previously mentioned that Renala did other things to build up her power base, all of which would culminate in her being able to declare herself as a queen, and her house as a monarchy. And so in this chapter, let us discuss Caria as a royal house and what its makeup is. Renala founded the house as royalty, and so at this point I do want to tackle one of the weird parts of the lore, something I've talked about in my previous videos, and that is the fact that when Ranni conjures the vision of Renala that we fight in the stage 2, She refers to Renala as the last queen of Caria.
Interesting. So Iman asks, who is Wilhelm? He is the dude who fights the raging wolf Vargrim in the Round Table Hold. The two dudes you fight when Bernal asks you to join him on his quest for the Volcano Manor. He's the Bloodborne mushroom guy overlooking the lake. That guy too, just without an H.
And this is a little strange given that she's the only queen of Caria. She's the founding queen. But Ranni's language on a surface level seems to suggest that she is the end of a long line. However, once again, Loki was able to provide me with an answer that I find quite satisfying. Loki believes that Ranni's word choice here is a reflection of Ranni's view of the Carian
Cool, because I was actually just looking that up right now.
monarchy and her place within it. Loki points to the ghost found in Caria Manor, the ghost of a Carian retainer or knight, and its dialogue belays a certain expectation among Carian retainers that Ranni would take the throne, so to speak.
Lady Ranni, we have long awaited you. I pray for your house's swift revival. May the full moon shine upon Caria.
This expectation isn't particularly surprising given all we have discussed so far. Ranni was clearly being groomed as the heir to Renala's throne, and so Loki suggests that this statement by Ranni, that Renala is the last queen of Caria, is a reference to the fact that Ranni has no intention of becoming the queen of Caria. Ranni has her own path, which goes far beyond being a queen, and as such her mother is the only true queen of the Carians, the last. With that said, let us now look at the forces.
Yeah, I can pretty much agree with that Ranni didn't step up to claim the title for herself, and so if she kind of abandoned her role as a Karian or as an Empyrean, then it would make sense that Renala would be the last queen of Caria.
That are under Renala's,
which it can be kind of vexing for some because that makes Renala the first queen and the last queen, and it can sound at times as though the passing down of things like the Dark Moon Greatsword and the ring and the discarded palace key, it could suggest more of a generational type thing when it's really a generation of one, because the Carian princesses kind of die out or something along those lines.
Command. And I think what is interesting about the Carian Royal House when compared to the Erdtree Royal House is the way that it enforces loyalty.
So Cantrell asks, why wouldn't one of the sisters take the throne then? Or did Ranni kill them too? So we don't actually know what happens to the sisters. One of the potential sisters could be Melina. I don't really strongly believe that pretty much at all, but I do know that's a pretty strong community idea that there must be a stronger connection between Melina and Ranni due to things like the spirit calling bell and the weird eye thing going on, and Melina being burned and bodiless, and Ranni literally having burned her body and discarding it. Or discarded it. So, yeah.
The Erdtree House very much did it through conquest, whereas the Carian House and its vassals are more closely bound through oaths of loyalty and chivalric values. The mainstay of Carian forces is of course the legendary Carian Knights, that numbered only a few, something we learn of via the Carian Knight Sword, which reads, "These knight swords could serve as catalysts, letting them wield sorceress battle skills. Despite numbering fewer than 20, this power made them a match for even the champions of gold in battle." So these knights are few in number but very elite, and given the council chamber seen at the top of Caria Manor, it suggests that they served as a sort of council as well, although that is just my speculation based on round table culture. The Carian Knights also welcome trolls into their rank, as evidenced by Bowles, the Carian Troll Knight, and the unnamed Carian Troll Knight found in Caria Manor. This is a marked difference from how the
And then there's also the Troll Knights by the converted Fringe Tower on the northeast side of Liurnia by Sauron.
majority of trolls are used in the lands between.
And then essentially 3 unnamed Carian Troll Knights patrolling the what's it called, the four belfries over here on the west side of Liurnia. This is the west side of Liurnia, if you didn't know, to the left of this guy.
This is a marked difference from how the majority of trolls are used in the lands between. As the degenerate cousins of the giants and hated enemies of the Erdtree realm, they are generally used as slaves or manual labour. However, the troll knights are treated with a sort of dignity, and the troll knight sword item description highlights just how differently they were treated under the Carians, as it reads, "Called into service when the queen invoked an oath they swore. The trolls are treated as true knights of Caria, and fight arm in arm with their human comrades."
So Mortis points out EG could be a Carian knight as well, which might be true, but part of the reason why I didn't include him is because his armor set is slightly different. At the very least, he doesn't use the troll knight helmet, but yeah, I think that's a really strong possibility too, which thanks for bringing that up. So Cantrell also asked, doesn't Melina have a gloam eye? Well, maybe. The thing with Melina is we don't know how much of her station is influenced by the pre-Erdtree burning times versus the post-burning times, and she only gets her eye like that after the Frenzied Flame ending. And is that because we burned the Erdtree and the Erdtree had some influence over her? It's just kind of unanswerable at this point. You think EG might be a retired knight? I could see that. True Connoisseur says, this is irrelevant to the video, but if the DLC doesn't touch on the Gloam-Eyed Queen stuff at all, FromSoft is just trolling us with that vague character. My friend, let me introduce you to Velka.
So in this brotherhood, the troll knights are treated as equal to their human counterparts, and this makes sense as the Carians would not have the same enmity for trolls that the Erdtree Royals would, because they didn't take part in that war. Indeed, if we remember the Carians' origins as astrologers, both the ancestors of the Carians and the ancestors of the trolls, the fire giants, coexisted in peace on the mountaintops. And so this partnership, this welcoming of trolls into the ranks of knights, is honouring that past. And so culturally we can expect the Carians to have a more even-handed view on giants and their kin. And because of this, they gain very powerful allies. Powerful knights that served with loyalty, but also gaining the guidance of the like of EG. We learn via the hammer item description that the art of smithing originated from the giants, hence why EG is such a skilled smith himself. Jiren even comments on how useful these weapons were in Radagon's war against the Scarlet Rot.
And funny thing, his swords were all blunt as stone, but not one of them decayed when faced with the Scarlet Rot.
Again, just another powerful asset for the Carian Royal House, an asset that would have been left.
I also think it's notable that EG's hammer is of the fire element, and at the very least, the flamberge that Jiren wields is kind of evocative of fire due to its shape. And so, even though the flamberge... Wait, does the flamberge have the fire element? I don't quite remember. Yeah, so it's just kind of curious how much of that is meant to be a specific fire versus rot thing, because that seemed like it was supposed to be stronger in development at some point. I mean, that isn't to say that that connection isn't there in the retail version of the game. It's just kind of secondary, really. They're like, oh, fire is kind of effective against rot, and then they just kind of leave it there. It's not like there's any kind of metaphysical fire that's better against rot. If there is, we don't really get mention of it. I could imagine that the flames of destined death would be really effective at curtailing scarlet rot, but we can't exactly use those so much anymore, can we? Flamberges bleed. Okay, it treads flesh, but it does mean flame blade, you think? Yeah, that's kind of literally what it is. So it's probably symbolic or unintentional. So it's been something that they've used in the previous games. I'm pretty sure in DS1 it talks about that verbatim, although it's been a minute. Flamberge's name comes from fire. Okay, thank you. And Right, and the other thing about a flamberge, like in real life, which is kind of funny that it can inflict bleed because they tend to be blunted extremely easily because they're extremely hard to sharpen due to their undulating design from the very little that I know about them.
On the table by the Erd Tree because they view
So yeah, anyway, my point with saying that they tend to be blunted very easily just kind of does go hand in hand with what Jiren was saying.
Carian Royal House,
German has Flammenschwert. Interesting.
an asset that would have been left on the table by the Erd Tree because they view the trolls as nothing more than just slaves. And while the Erd Tree forces clearly also armed trolls to be used as slave warriors, it's hard to compare them against the knightly trolls of the Carian house who have been trained to use magic, and serve not because they are slaves, but because of a powerful oath. And something I missed but Loki picked up on, so again credit to Loki, is that Renala gathered other allies to her side through oaths as well. Loki highlighted the summons that Renala uses in stage 2 of her fight with us. Renala summons giants, dragons, and wolves, and each time she does so she says, "Come Oathsworn." So again, these aren't just slaves or summons, these are beings, animals, trolls, and dragons, that have sworn an oath of loyalty to Renala, that she.
And so there are a couple other cut summons she could have potentially had at one point. So she does call on Blythe in one of the cut dialogues. She also calls on Hermes, although I looked into the Hermes thing. The Japanese is Hirumesu, not like Aramesu, which is how like Hermes, at least the clothing brand, or the maybe not clothing, the luxury brand is called in Japanese. And so Hirumes seems to relate to a character from some anime, which I can't recall. And that was that character's like real name, but that character's nickname was Silver Mask. So I've wondered whether or not there was ever meant to be a silver mask to juxtapose against the gold mask that appeared in this game, but obviously this is like supercut content and I have no idea how relevant it is. It's just kind of something that I stumbled upon and thought it was pretty neat and is worth sharing.
He then calls upon. So I think you're starting to get the picture that oaths are important to Carian culture. They didn't just want people to serve them, they wanted them to be bound to the Carians through loyalty and oaths.
So, Scowleezy says, also all blades should cause bleeding if we're going off of realism. I would disagree with that. I know you're making a joke, but generally speaking, like the heavier the blade, the more blunt it can be, because it's really the weight of the blade which causes the damage. So, like traditionally, if I'm remembering correctly, like a legitimate Zweihander doesn't need to have a sharp blade because it's the weight of the blade which will like rend their foes asunder. So you don't need to spend a lot of time sharpening the blade. And with that kind of philosophy in mind, I could understand why not every blade would inflict the bleed status, because not every blade is meant to lacerate their foes quite that way to inflict bleeding in real life. So, I mean, obviously, if you slash somebody and it cuts them open, there's not going to be blood. I don't disagree with that. It's just a difference between trying to bleed someone out versus tear them apart, I guess, which is splitting hairs, pun intended. Most swords are surprisingly light. Correct. Yeah, so most swords, from what I understand, tend to weigh less than 1 to 2 pounds because any higher, it just tends to become a bit more unwieldy. And for those who think that sounds like ridiculously light, I would suggest like going to a batting range or something like that and like picking up a bat and realizing how light they are, and just if you feel like you can hit a ball farther with a heavier bat, I would recommend, trying to use a metal bat versus a wooden one. And comparing that to like what professional baseball players use, it's mostly wooden bats. Sometimes they get corked on the inside to, anyway, that's not too important. It's essentially like the weight of a weapon can end up being a detriment to it because like speed becomes a bigger factor, and you don't want to have to turn your blade slowly because it just slows down your reaction and deflection time, when a fraction of a second can literally make the difference between life and death in close quarters combat. Same with maces, around 2 to 4 pounds. Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Troll Knight sword that we looked at obviously tells us that these knights were bound to them via an oath, and this of course makes sense because they are essentially knights of this royal house, and in medieval history when you are a knight, you are indeed bound to your liege through oaths. The term oath is also used in regards to another Carian vassal, Jiren the Witch Hunter, and ally to General Radagon. We can learn of this via the eccentric armor set, Jiren's set, which reads the following. Jiren preferred a nomadic existence, but after spending time as a guest of the Carian Royals, he became a guest commander for General Radagon, and for the first time the restless tumbleweed would be bound by an honourable oath. These oaths are described as honourable, and they seem to have the effect of creating real ties of loyalty, especially when you consider what Jiren went through for the Carians. He stood by the degenerating Radagon for God knows how long. His dialogue that we quoted earlier, where he discusses Iji's weapons, suggests he was actually serving by Radagon's side during the war against the Scarlet Rot.
And one of the most fascinating things to me about their oaths to each other, particularly, is that they are oaths of sworn death, which is interesting because presumably the idea of destined death shouldn't have existed in the lands between, depending on one's interpretation of the timeline. So what the hell were these two idiots doing, swearing a death oath to each other, when death, as we know it, should have been quote-unquote removed from the Elden Ring and or the lands between? So obviously there is a bit more nuance to it, because we do know that there are other forms of death through like battle and whatnot, but it's just kind of ironic and really hilarious to me by the same token.
And he even assisted in putting General Radagon to his final rest, all the while having Selin tied up so he could fulfill his real oath, which was to kill Selin.
Now the festival is over, and General Radagon is defeated. Jiren's duties are finally fulfilled. Though we served different masters, I could see he was truly adept in his role. Now the time has come to remind him of an old promise made. With the stars of fate set into motion, a certain sorceress is dispossessed of her immortality. Finally, we can be rid of a long-standing Carian weed.
Jiren is described in his armor set as someone who is a tumbleweed who doesn't want to put down roots, and yet because of the loyalty that the Carians inspire, he did put down roots, and went through great effort to fulfill his oath to the family. There is another rather interesting oath.
So this is completely unrelated to the game, but it just kind of reminds me of a proverb that exists in both English and Japanese, but has the exact opposite meanings, ironically enough, in that a rolling stone gathers no moss. So in the West, when we hear that, we tend to think, oh, okay, so if you're always on the move, that means like that would stave off like the aging process and whatnot. But in Japan, like growing moss is kind of like a sign of beauty and is something desired. So like settling down and allowing the moss to accumulate is kind of a good thing. So that's just kind of ironic that it's literally the same phrase, but the perspective is just completely different between cultures. And so that's just kind of like the whole idea of the tumbleweed just made me think of that.
Between the Carians and another unusual ally, the Crystallians. And this is something we can learn of via the magic downpour item description, which reads the following. One of the sorceries of the Carian Royal Family, said to have been taught by the Crystallians to mark the swearing of the Old Concord. As to what the details of this concord was, we can only guess, beyond the fact Carians were granted a deeper insight into magic directly from these unusual beings. We can also find crystallians present in Moonlight Altar alongside dragons, again implying that Renala established these concords early on in her rise to power, before settling down in Caria Manor, and that she somehow bound these unusual beings to her service. Ranni, as a Carian princess, seems to continue this tradition of making her oaths with her vassals. This is most clearly seen in her relationship with her shadow, Blythe, and this is in many ways the greatest illustration of the loyalty that the Carians inspired, as Blythe is already bound to Ranni in a cosmic fashion, through the power of the Two Fingers.
I was once an Empyrean, of the demigods. Only I, Mikola, and Melania could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own Two Fingers, as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age, which is when I received Blythe, in the form of a vassal tailored for an Empyrean.
And yet, despite that, Ranni still requires Blythe to take an oath, swearing loyalty to her not as an Empyrean, but as his liege. And we learn of this via the Royal Greatsword, which reads, "In defiance of the fate he was born into, Blythe swore to serve no master but Ranni. As proof, the sword was imbued with a cold magic at the moment the oath was sworn." Blythe literally ends up defying his own nature in favour of his loyalty to Ranni, his words and his covenant with her more powerful than the cosmic forces of the world. The Carians are even able to bind dragons to their will, as evidenced by Adula, the dragon that guards Ranni. And we learn from Adula's Moonblade that this dragon is specifically tied to Ranni. However, Renala also summons an oath-bound dragon during her Stage 2 fight with us, implying that Renala also bound dragons to her service in the same way. And then when you look at Moonlight Altar and you see how densely populated it is with dragons, this makes sense. I've always assumed that these dragons found on Moonlight Altar, apart from Adula, are ones that the Carians bound into their service. This sort of chivalric culture is the core of the Carians' identity, and is how they differ from the Erdtree monarchy. And as a result, while the Carians probably don't have as big an army as the Erdtree forces, we can already see how they were able to put up such a fearsome fight. They had trolls, dragons, and soldiers willing to die for them, bound in a sort of loyalty that the Erdtree forces could never know. Of course, we can't talk about the Carian chivalric culture.
I don't know about that specifically in terms of like a form of loyalty that the Erdtree forces could never know, because there's certainly a large amount of people who had a very high degree of faith in the Erdtree, and I think pointing to the Erdtree Guardians could be a good parallel example of that, in that it was promised that their deaths would not lead to destruction, and they were kind of reborn as the Erdtree Guardians, and all that. So while I do think Smotown brings up a good point in that the Carians probably had a stronger interfactional force, maybe it just is worth considering that incantations suck without being able to use Dragon Communion incantations. I don't know. But on a more serious note, I really do wish that it was kept in the game that there were only ever like 16 Crucible Knights, because that can make it sound more comparable to how the Glintstone, or sorry, the Carian Knights, the Carian Knights specifically could number fewer than 20, yet still provide a match for the forces of the Erdtree. And it might also be worth considering, we don't know if it was supposed to be like a war that was being conducted on multiple fronts and the resources were just terrible. And as they say, like, supply wins wars. It's true, maybe like the forces of the Erdtrees just had like some other issues going on, because it doesn't make a ton of sense to me that Radagon should have been the one to try and conquer Liurnia, because Godfrey still kind of existed in that time, because Godfrey should not have yet been hounded from the lands between, because that shouldn't have happened until Radagon returned to Leyndell based on Muriel's dialogue. Now, I don't really like to question this so much, but it might actually be worth questioning every once in a while. We don't know how reliable Muriel's information could be. So there is the potential that Muriel is mistaken for whatever reason, and the timeline could be slightly different than we perceive it right now, just because we don't really have a full picture of what happened when. Esprit de Corps was likely hired too. Hey Bella, welcome back to the stream. So is this actually a new one? I don't think this is that new, is it? 2 months ago? Okay, yeah, I guess it is kind of new. Amateur study tactics, professional study logistics. Kind of true, unironically.
Without discussing the most honourable knight in the lands between, Loretta. We learn about Loretta via her armour set, which reads the following. Loretta was once a royal Carian knight, and her lapis lazuli blue cape is the emblem of the knightly pride that continues to guide her. Of course, Loretta is no longer in service to the Carians, and we can see this from Loretta's war sickle, where her blue glintstone of the Carians has been replaced with the unallied gold of Mikola.
And then we still have the weird phantasm version of Loretta up here. I'll say it now, so that way if I don't ever get back to the point at some time during the video, maybe somebody will remind me. But I think it's possible that there could be more going on with glintstone and souls and whatnot that might be worth mentioning again at some point. So I know I'm being really vague here, but I don't want to just spit it out with a bunch of context to go with it. So Cantrell asks, wasn't Godfrey supposed to have conquered all their enemies? So that would mean the sorcerers weren't a threat. So is it a plot hole? So yeah, we don't really know, and this is partially why I tend to believe in the Pangea theory a bit more, because if the lands were a little bit more interconnected at a previous time, it would allow Godfrey to head off in a different direction and be able to kind of ignore Liurnia, because the layout of the lands could have just been different. And so he could have been off doing something else. But because of the way the lands are currently laid out, it really does not make much sense at all that he would go from Altus Plateau through Liurnia, yet not deal with any of the Carians or the sorcerers, then screw off in Stormvale and down to the Weeping Peninsula and Castle Morn and or Caelid. It's just a really weird campaign, especially because his campaign is supposed to have been unbowed and undefeated. So maybe he was the real Sun Tzu of the lands between and just only fought the battles he knew he could win. And so he just pieced out on the whole Liurnian campaign. But, a bit of heavy speculation in the chat here.
Marking her change of allegiance. However, as the armour set says, while she no longer serves the Carian house, the chivalric values that she learned under them is what guides her to be one of the most honourable people that we see in this game. I think it's greatly implied that Loretta somehow stands above the other Carian knights, as is evident by her more extravagant armour and armaments. And I've always assumed that the phantom version of Loretta we fight in Caria Manor is a conjured version that Ranni has made, showing how valued she still is even in her absence. And when fighting her, it is clear to see why she would be so valued. She is...
So yeah, saying that Ranni could have conjured that version of Loretta is interesting. I don't necessarily hate that idea. It's just one of those ones where I'm like, yeah, I could see that, but I can't really be fully supportive of it either, just because there is that level of ambiguity, which is present in almost everything in a FromSoft game.
Extremely powerful, both in her martial prowess and her spellcraft, characterized by her fearsome magic bow. Yet Loretta, of course, is most well known for her quest to find a new home for the Albinaurics. This is what leads her to the Halig Tree and her service to Mikola. Loretta's mastery tells us that she travelled long and far to find a home for the Albinaurics, and given she is settled in the Halig Tree, changed her allegiance to Mikola, and we can find Albinaurics in the consecrated snowfield, it's heavily implied that Mikola offered a safe haven for these Albinaurics, and in return, Loretta gave him her loyalty. The consecrated snowfield became a sort of fabled land, a legend to the Albinauric people.
A chosen land awaits us, Albinaurics. The medallion is the key that leads to the city. It's only a quaint treasure for we who cannot make the journey. But for dear Latenna, it is needed to fulfill her purpose.
And this was
So, hey, Boric Wapsiko, welcome back to the stream. It's been a minute. So Radagon is fighting Carian and Liurnia while Godfrey was fighting the Stormlord / Placidusax? Maybe. We don't really know, and I feel like no matter how you try to reconcile the timeline of events, you're going to run into some issues because it doesn't make any damn sense to me that Radagon would have fought in Liurnia twice and literally started a family and all that stuff, and then gone back to the time when Godfrey was banished from the Lands Between, because Godfrey's campaign is described in such a way where it makes it sound as though it's like one unending campaign, like Genghis Khan style. And so why the hell did it take Godfrey so long to attain victory, spanning enough time for Radagon to meet Renala, have multiple children with Renala, and also have enough time pass so that Ranni could have been big enough to learn the lunar sorceries from her mother before her mother became heartbroken. So, some people tend to think there could be some time shenanigans going on because of like the storm beyond time, and so it's possible Godfrey left at one point and just like came back later. Maybe. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite seem to work that way for us when we fight Placidusax, but it is also questionable if we interact with Placidusax quite the same way that Godfrey would have interacted with the Stormlord. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where I'm not so sure the writing is the most coherent that it could be, but hopefully that answers your question. Is definitely multiple campaigns, yeah. And so I tend to think that this might have also coincided with Grandsax attacking the capital, but again, we just don't really have the full picture to say for sure.
was all achieved by Loretta, who clearly showed great compassion to the Albinaurics. Now, when it comes to the creation of the Albinaurics, as you will see in my Nox and Albinauric lore videos, I'm certainly of the mind that the Albinaurics were originally created by the Nox, and I won't retread that entire video here, but a summary of my main reasons for believing so are as follows. The Nox have an obsession with creating a Lord of Night. There is a cut dialogue from Tops that directly states that the Albinaurics are a creation of the Eternal Cities. The Nox are well versed in alchemy, as is evidenced by the Celestial Dew and the Puppet Draft. They've also worked with other silver beings, namely the Silver Tears, beings that can mimic things, again suggesting that these beings, these malleable creatures, were meant to create an artificial Lord of Night. There is a cut dialogue featuring a mimic tier called Asimi, who directly states that again these Silver Tears are creations of the Eternal City, and thus with all this together it isn't hard to believe that the Albinaurics are another creation of the Eternal Cities.
And then one other aspect of that, which doesn't come across in the translation super well, is that the term Albinauric, well, the Chinese characters for these dudes can kind of break down as white plus gold, which is what you would get from like Albinauric, like Albi as in albino and auric as in aurum as in gold, which is why its chemical element is Au, aurum. So it's white gold Albinauric, but as far as that's concerned in Japanese, like the term white gold is, well, it can be read as shirogane without the kanji, and that's kind of how it's written. So these are shirogane bito, which means like silver people. And so if they're silver people, it would not be much of a stretch of the imagination that the silver people could be related to Silver Tears, in addition to everything else Smotown was talking about. So, Mr. Yada asked, are the Nox supposed to be the same as the Night Folk? That is a really good question that, again, we don't get the answer to. However, it is definitely notable that in Karya Manor you can get the Urumi, which does say that it came from the Night Folk, because other than the Urumi and the like hereditary thing that you can pick from the character select screen, there's literally no other mention of the Night Folk, and the Night Folk are said to have bled silver. So it's possible the Night Folk could have been like the Albinaurics, but we don't really know, because the reason why I say Albinaurics is because when they're in droplet form, they can bleed silver, but when they've transformed, they only ever bleed red. Unless you like visceral them, but that's not too important. Hey, Bella asks, am I of the opinion that Loretta is physically related to the Albinaurics? No. So I think it's pretty clear in both the English and the Japanese that the rumor is supposed to be preposterous. So, well, I do admit it is written as a rumor and there could be a kernel of truth to it. At least for now, I will kind of take it at face value that Loretta is most likely not an Albinauric until I'm given more reason to think otherwise. Oversight on the writing is pretty common. It's not the first time it's happened in the FromSoft games. They had to piece together what Martin wrote or just took what they wanted from it. An author that doesn't think his plots through and ran into the same issue. So yeah, I know it's really common for some people to think that George R.R. Martin had an absolutely huge amount of influence over the game, and that might be true to an extent if we compare it to something like turning the rudder of a ship. I think he could have done that rather than been the actual shipwright who designed like every little feature on the ship. So hopefully that example makes sense, where like he could have definitely influenced the direction of the game, but I don't think he really crafted a lot of the finer details, which I think many people give him credit for, just because of how many things I've seen change between pre-release builds of the game and the retail build. And of course, me saying it like that makes it sound like, oh, I have some like insider knowledge. No, I'm just talking about stuff that I would see in like 1.0 or like the Chinese version of like the 1.0 dialogue or descriptions, where it says things like Morgoth was the Elden Lord, the fact that Horaru was Gold Mask, and things of that nature. Also, there was that one trailer or something like that which said that Radagon was the Slayer of Giants, which is just mind-bogglingly different from what we get into the retail version of the game, to the point which shows that if George R.R. Martin did have an influence, it's not like he gave us like the full complete blueprint that I think some people believe that to have been, which isn't to say that he didn't have an influence at all, and he probably has had an influence in many ways that I might not have expected, but at least for now we don't really know what those are, and I do think there's reason to doubt a lot of it. But, that's just kind of all it is doubt. So take what I believe with a grain of salt, and I will respond in kind. Borquapsico says, seems to them like the Night Folk are the descendants of the Silver Tears and the Nox / other people, hence the Silver Blood. Yeah, and so I think that's a possibility, but we don't really know. And that's always kind of a pain. All the cities in Elden Ring give you but a big feeling of Heroes and Might and Magic 5 feeling, as well as battles and wars, as there's so much going on at the same time. Mortis says, George confirmed he wrote the fundamentals, but the very basic stuff. Like, he probably made what would become the Scarlet Rot, but he did not make Scarlet Rot as we know it. Okay, so yeah. On the Discord, we do have a pinned comment, I believe, in the Elden Ring lore chat, or it might be in the resources, where it talks about, it's a compilation of a bunch of the interviews that George R.R. Martin gave, and I think it does paint a pretty, I don't want to say like a fully like clear picture, but it gives a pretty good indication that like he helped come up with maybe some like core central ideas, but I believe much of the fleshing out of the game really came down to FromSoft, because George R. R. Martin has seemed quite as surprised about some aspects of the game as I think some of the fans were. And we do have Miyazaki quoted as saying like he wanted to present George R. R. Martin with a vision of the lands between, which would surprise even him, based off of like the materials that George had provided for FromSoft. Yeah, and as True Connoisseur says, Martin himself suggested he didn't do all that much beyond giving them a big timeline for the world's history. Okay. Thank you guys for the comments. Going back to the video.
An artificial being created in the hopes of producing a Lord of Night. However, in that same video, I did also touch on another connection that the Albinaurics have. The connection to Rennala the Carian that goes beyond their heavy presence in this region. Zuli the Witch did a video in which they revealed the silver armour of the female Albinaurics once had a different description pre-release. At one point, the item description of this silver armour attributed the creation of the female Albinaurics to Rennala the Carian, and I will let Passmo describe what my thoughts on this contradiction is. What is the truth behind their creation? Did the Nox create them, or was it a Rennala the Carian or Carian creation? Well, the balance of truth is for you to decide, but I believe both could be true. I do believe that they do originate from the work of the Nox. The evidence we looked at previously is too strong, and the thematics fit very well. However, it could have been expanded upon by Rennala the Carians and Carians. My belief is that the work did originate with the Nox as an experiment to create a Lord of Night, but that the Rennala the Carians and Carians may well have piggybacked off it in an attempt to create warriors and servants, and this would explain why there are so many Albinaurics in Liurnia, specifically some serving the Carian Royal Family. And I more or less stand by this. However,
I agree with everything that guy said. It's just kind of funny. So one idea that I've had about the Nox in relation to the Albinaurics specifically is that I have wondered whether they took the silver tiers, or the mimic tiers specifically, and were trying to create extra bodies for themselves to transplant their primal glintstones into, so that way they could have a form of reincarnation or rebirth, or just a way of evading death in general, which I think is a pretty big thematic idea at the core of Elden Ring, that a lot of these kind of disparate groups were trying to circumvent death one way or another. But again, that is some pretty heavy speculation on my part. I like it because, I mean, I'm going to pull like a past Smo and agree with everything that I said previously, you know. But yeah, anyway. Paul, welcome into the stream again. The way you understood it was Gurm worked on the world building pre-shattering, or maybe even longer ago. So yeah, I definitely think that Gurm could have provided a pretty good picture of the world pre-shattering, but like I said before, with some of like the changes in development, with Morgott having been called an Elden Lord, I'm really skeptical at like how relevant Gurm's vision was to the final build. All right, so I think an ad just started playing again, but anyway, Morta said he did confirm he made the demigods and that their powers and what their powers were in the Stephen Colbert interview, and that's why he brought up Scarlet Rot in your example. And I think Scarlet Rot is probably just like one of the coolest ideas for an ability in the way it's been implemented into the game. Like just seeing a full landscape utterly transformed by Scarlet Rot was just like peak gaming for me that year, and I wish the rest of the game was quite as brave as like what they did with Caelid in terms of like presenting a cohesive narrative between the state of the world and like its inhabitants, just because like of how much millennia really affected one specific region and how foreign and alien she ended up making Caelid feel. You still wonder what the giant stow heads on Fire and Limgrave were about in the network test data? Sorry, that's pretty off topic. So those giant heads are kind of similar to what many people in the community will call like the Crucible statue, where it's got like the burning figure on it, like in the middle of like a like the growing. I guess it's probably easier to show a picture than fail to describe it. It's the thing that you can see in the Round Table Hold and on the Altus Plateau Highway quite a bit. Is this it? Kind of. Okay, so the statue that I'm talking about is this dude. So it's the same face as what's on that statue. Obviously, that's like the worst quality I could possibly give you. Okay, this is it. So this dude. So yeah, the burning heads were essentially like this guy or gal, and you can see that it's kind of got like the weird like burn marks on its body. So this version of the statue in Lane Dell is significantly different from the other ones because it's got like gold inside it, kind of. But anyway. Yeah, that dude. Mr. Yada likes the description of Scarlet Rot as an alternative form of life that's simply incompatible with normal beings. So I don't necessarily think it's incompatible with normal beings. I think the issue is that, like, death got removed. So Scarlet Rot is what I would just kind of always compare to like a cancer in the world, and that it's an aberrant form of life because it's a form of life that just keeps proliferating, which kind of ends up breaking down other forms of life, but it doesn't really kill them. So it's just kind of like an excruciating existence, I guess. So I think Mikola and Melania kind of have the same affliction, just kind of being presented in different symptoms. So Mikola is given eternal vitality, eternal youth, eternal childhood as his kind of form of a curse, whereas Melania is given what I would call boundless life, which it's literally a cancer. What was the anime that inspired Caelid? That's a good question. Everyone's going to say Berserk, though. Might be like the Flame of Chaos 2.0, its life out of control. Yeah.
For since then, my ideas on this have somewhat refined, especially in my discussions with Loki, where I had previously stated that the Rennala the Carian sorcerers may have just replicated this research one for one. Loki goes further to suggest that the female Albinaurics specifically mark the Rennala the Carian contribution to the research. The female versions are more sophisticated, being able to pursue combat in a way that the older ones are not able to, whilst also retaining their intelligence unlike the second generation or frog Albinaurics, perhaps speaking to the fact that these are a second attempt or V2, and thus having more sophisticated results. I am now however going to directly quote Loki's reasoning on the matter, as I find it quite compelling. Female Albinaurics are both young, eloquent, and uniquely given large wolves from mountaintops to ride. Same wolves, leftovers from halted experiments, are left wandering around Carian Manor. In short, they are Carian first generation built off Nox's previous experiments, or third generation Albinaurics in general. Loretta.
So I think one part of this idea that I don't know if Smo and or Loki have considered is that they might be reading into the Rennala the Carian thing from a previous version of the game without necessarily thinking about the broader context of what that meant. And I could be wrong about this here, but I think that there's probably meant to have been a stronger connection between the Carians and the Nox specifically. So to say that the Carians created the Albinauric women could be true, but it is also questionable how closely tied to the Nox they were at that point in the development. And I don't know how differentiated they were supposed to be, which isn't to say that they're wrong here, but I don't know if we have the full picture, which is always one of the biggest risks with looking at content, because quite often we are missing that context. And in a lot of cases, that content might not actually be representative of like the final build of the game. So it's a real risky play that doesn't always pay off, which, yeah, okay.
Loretta learns from observing these adept wolf-riding archers firsthand at Carian Manor. I'm leaning towards the Carians and Rennala the Carians picking up the work established by the Nox, and that the female version specifically may be a Rennala the Carian or Carian refinement on the same formula. But do you agree with Loki that Loretta is a human knight who learned combat style from the Albinaurics, and thus grew to pity them? Or do you think that Loretta is the culmination of the Carian refinement of the Albinauric formula, and that she is essentially the ultimate Albinauric? It is hard to discount.
That's an interesting idea. I don't think she's the ultimate Albinauric, but she may have originally been intended that way, just because some of the description on her items in particular have definitely changed over time. I would need to double check her 1.0 stuff, but it was definitely substantially different from retail. Let me look it up real quick just for you guys. Wait, what? Okay. What is her armor set actually called? Because this is not it. One moment. Royal Knight armor. Okay. Forgot what it's called in 1.0. Do I have it? A picture of it? I'm probably. Oh wait, no. I have footage. That'd probably be faster. Boss. Okay, where are we at? Okay, so it's a little bit further. Oh. All right, so Royal Guard. Okay, Royal Guard. A silver helm of the Arbor Sentinels who served the sacred tree of Mikola, the Scion Empyrean, features a huge circular wood crest. Hailing from Raya Lucaria, these enchanted knights once belonged to the Carian Royal Family, but were later gifted to Mikola, recipient of the Vision by King Consort Radagon. So obviously, that is remarkably different from what we get in the retail build of the game. Okay, so that's pretty much the same. The lapis blue trimmings reveal these origins. So, yeah. This does make me more skeptical that Loretta could have been an Albinauric woman even like further in the past. And so I think I'll just go with the description kind of being more of a rumor, which is all well and good, essentially. Oh, you're talking about Nausicaa as the anime for Caelid? Yeah, Nausicaa is probably my favorite Ghibli movie. That's not actually a Ghibli movie. True Connoisseur says, even with the more vague Nox-Karian connections of the game, they are somewhat united in their reverence for the moon and the night, even if their distinct moon religions aren't one-to-one. Yeah, I agree with that. So, I thought there was one other thing that I was going to mention about Loretta and the Carians in relation to Loki. I did talk about the dangers of the cut content, which was important. So yeah, I just feel like I'm forgetting something, but oh well, rip.
The similar styles of combat, the horseback archery. Whatever you believe in the Carian or Raya the Carian involvement in the Albinaurics, what is clear is that the Carians incorporated Albinaurics into their service, as is evident by Pidia and other Albinaurics found within Caria Manor. So now we can see why the Carians would have been such a formidable force when the Erdtree forces would attack. Not only were they led by the most powerful sorcerer of all time, who had united the entire lands of Liurnia under her control, but she had loyal elite knights, trolls, crystallians, and dragons all sworn to her service, never mind the resources of the Academy and its sorcerers, as well as being led by Renala, the most powerful sorcerer of an age. Liurnia had developed into a real power with its own culture, and thus the stage would be set for the conflict that would become known as the Wars of Liurnia.
That's some pretty cool footage.
So if you've seen my Elden Ring timeline video, you know that I generally place the Liurnian Wars as something that happened after the era of the Erdtree conquest, that it happened quite a bit after the wars with the giant, after the Golden Order was firmly established. This would take a long time to...
So I know for that video specifically, Smowtown is a bit more reliant on Tarnished Archaeologist's timeline of events, which I have major issues with, because he puts the Shattering contemporaneous with the end of the Age of Abundance, which I think really has a lot of flaws in that idea, because it fails to account for the timeline of Radagon's children and America's children in the form of like the twin Empyreans and everything like that. So maybe Smowtown's perspective here is a little bit different than in that video specifically.
To fully explain once again, as I've done it several times throughout.
So Iman says, it's strange that Renala uses Comet Azure. So to be fair, I mean, she does use Comet Azure, but the Carian treasure, the Sword of Night and Flame, kind of also uses a similar style attack as Comet Azure. So this could have been one of those cases where ideas about what Comet Azure was changed over time, and so it might have like been forgotten exactly how the Sword of Night and Flame worked. So okay, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to bring up at one point. Yeah, the Sword of Night and Flame. So in what context did I want to talk about that? Damn it. I know I wanted to mention it earlier at one point in the video, but I didn't. I forgot. Mika Medellin, welcome in. Nausicaa must be Miyazaki's favorite too, considering how many times he referenced it in these games. Oh, I'm like, different Miyazaki. Okay, I got you. I thought you were talking about Hayao Miyazaki. You think Slave Knight Gale's design is based on Nausicaa's character too? Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's just an absolutely brilliant movie. I still need to go back and like read the manga, because it's like came out after the movie, surprisingly enough, and it's supposed to expand upon the world. I just absolutely adore the art style of like the late 80s, kind of mid 80s like anime, when the characters like a little bit more proportional or more realistically proportional, but yeah, there's just something about that one specifically that I can't really articulate. Morty says, the Sword of Night and Flame calls it a comet, but the Night Comet spell is nothing like that. It feels like a translation thing. It's not a translation thing. I know I've definitely looked into that stuff in the past, and it is just... it's a dev thing. Hate to say. Bella says, when you buy manga, do you usually buy it in Japanese, or does it depend? It depends. I mean, I honestly don't really buy a lot of manga, just because like the physical medium ends up taking up a lot of space, and I don't really like to own a lot of things, because I spent like a decent amount of years on the move, and like the more things you own, the more of a pain in the ass it is to move. So when I buy manga, it tends to be in Japanese, just because, you know, it's a bit of like language practice. So, yeah. And also, like, it's really a pain in the ass to get English manga, from what I understand. Like, it can be really expensive. So the times where I have bought manga have mostly been like when I've been in Japan, or if I randomly like found a book. Like, I think I'm trying to remember where I bought it, but I definitely bought like the first 2 volumes of Death Note. But I mean, I haven't really found them so much out here in the US. But anyway, thanks for the question. Bork says, they love TA's work, but some critical details seemed a bit capricious or way off. So yeah, that's what one of the like main criticisms I have against TA, and that I think, while I really enjoy a lot of the historical parallels that they bring to the lore discussion, I feel like they are misused in a way which kind of detracts from many people's understanding of the actual text of the games. So I just feel like the channel has like a lot of wasted potential, to be honest, and that's just kind of really sad, for me at least. And I don't really enjoy talking like negatively about creators. I want them to produce better work at the end of the day. Oh yeah, and Mortis says they use Viz and Shonen Jump. Oh yeah, that's a fair thing too. Like now, I guess manga has become a lot more accessible in the form of like applications or apps, not like physical applications, but you know the App Store and stuff like that. Because Shonen Jump definitely has their own app. Viz does as well. One of the complaints that I do have about those apps, at least like their English versions, is that they're purely English versions, and I think they would probably benefit from having like multilingual releases of their work, and would probably like, encourage more sales of like their memberships and stuff if you could access both languages side by side, or like turn on a setting, or you know they just like had them separated by categories or something like that. It's taken about 5 or so years to translate JoJo up to part 6. So thanks for answering the question. Yeah, oh yeah. So I don't know if I like articulated it well enough because I'm, you know, in the streamer brain mode. But like one of the concerns that I do have about like buying an English version of a manga is like the production just tends to be like really spotty. So you never know if they're actually going to go through and like finish it unless you know you're deliberately buying an already finished product. I mean, and obviously certain things are like a bit better. Like, if you buy something that's extremely popular, probably something that's ongoing that's extremely popular. I guess JoJo would be a good example, or One Punch Man. Those are probably likely to like reach the end of their cycles. But if you're reading something more niche, you better cross your fingers that the publisher doesn't like drop them for one reason or another. Bork says, "You think TA may need a good translator's help?" I feel like that's a veiled comment. I don't know. So, like, TA's approach to the lore is different in that they don't want to interact with differences of translation. They want to focus more on visual imagery. Whereas I don't necessarily think they always need like translation work. I feel like even if they just worked a bit more closely to the game text at times, it would be better off. But I mean, that's kind of also a pretty vain thing for me to say, I'll admit, just because, like, what I'm essentially saying is I don't like TA because they don't agree with me, which, I mean, you know, certainly there's going to be an amount of bias that I have about how I interpret the lore, but I feel like some of the issues that TA has is just going to be, like, really resolved just from, like, looking at the text itself. So like some of the disagreements that I have with Smo here, like this stuff is like, you know, virtually nothing. These are just like flavor differences and differences of like individual interpretation. And Smo typically does a very good job of articulating when he's using more speculation. And like I think this is probably one of the only examples in all of his videos that I watched where he was talking about the like mining of glintstone, which I don't necessarily disagree with his conclusion. I was just like, oh, I don't think you should have like phrased it exactly this way because it sounds more substantive than it actually is. So, whereas I feel like with TA, they tend to use a lot more authoritative language, and if oh no, that's kind of a lie. Well, it's not, but it is, but it's not. So let me try to articulate this a bit more clearly. I think with tarnished archaeologists, at times they speak authoritatively about their claims that they like set up for themselves. So they speak with authority about their claims specifically, not necessarily claims about the game at times, if that makes sense. But because of the way they approach the lore by tying it into potential real world influences, it gives them the appearance of having more authority about the game's text than they actually do. So, a lot of their real world parallels are pretty compelling at times, but they don't necessarily directly connect into the game. And I don't think a lot of casual viewers really pick up on that. TA seems to take things way too literally, especially in interpreting the imagery. I mean, I feel like I shouldn't throw a stone in a glass house by like taking things literally, because I tend to try to stay pretty literal and one-to-one to the text as much as I can. Obviously, I try to be mindful of when I think the game is using figurative language or figurative imagery and whatnot. But yeah, I do think that TA goes down certain rabbit holes and cherry picks their data to support their conclusion rather than taking evidence and building upon it, and the evidence leads to a conclusion. I feel like they kind of start with a conclusion and support that than the other way around. Viz Media's gotten better at translating stuff, but they cannot get a good JoJo schedule going. Yeah, and so like I know there is just a lot of stuff going on in like Japan and Korea with like the whole animation schedules and everything. Obviously that isn't quite as pertinent to JoJo to some degree, but I know like there's been a lot of shit going down in what's it called? Mappa. The animators for Jujutsu Kaisen, amongst many other series, and their animators are they are going through it. It's a real rough time over there. So yeah. Micah loves JoJo, but the fact that we're just now getting the first official Part 6 English releases is pretty frustrating. Yeah, and some stuff it's like licensing, other stuff it's like finding the translators and or publishers. It can be a real nuanced thing, and the thing is like a corporation or a company is not going to be able to respond to the market's needs nearly as quickly as like a fan translation group with just like, you know, 1 to 3 raw editors and typesetters and like 1 to 2 translators that work, you know, 20 projects at a time. They just don't have the mobility to match that because their corporate structure isn't set up to enable that. Thanks for the honesty and sorry for the derail. It's okay. Yeah, I mean, I try to be as honest as I can with myself and others, but yeah. Dr. Zaius gets skeptical when he starts going off about one, well, this thing looks like the other real life thing, so they are the same thing. Yeah, I tend to be the same way, but yeah, okay. Mappa sounds like hell to work for. It's the hours, yeah. True Connoisseur thinks TA's takes would be better or more enriched if they paralleled the work of the broader lore community. It feels like they're doing a lot of their thinking in a vacuum. So, yeah, I mean, to be fair, I don't blame TA for working that way at all, because that is also how I interacted with the lore for, you know, like the first year or so, maybe a little bit longer, of Elden Ring, because I wanted my thoughts to be my own, because it's a hell of a lot harder to get someone else's thoughts out of your head than it is to come up with your own theories and piece them together. Which doesn't necessarily mean what you come up with on your own is any better than anybody else's or vice versa. But I think there is value for both approaches, because the benefit of like working on one's own is that how do I phrase it without just like repeating myself? That's part of the problem. Like, I feel like I might not have gotten to the conclusion about the Crucible quite the way that I did if I just... Sorry, the dog is running in her sleep. I don't know if you guys could hear her. What was I saying? Oh yeah, I don't think I would have gotten to the conclusions that I had about things like relating to the Crucible and whatnot with if I was like looking at other people's stuff, because it really would have been easy to take a lot of things about that for granted. And obviously the way that I approach lore is going to be very different than most other people's, because I have the luxury of being able to look at it in multiple languages. So that gives me an avenue of approach that most people won't be able to take. And so my interpretations of things are going to be really impacted by that experience, where like most people aren't going to get that. So yeah, I don't know. It's just a real difficult thing to try to navigate. And part of the reason why I started looking at other people's content here is because I kind of felt like I was reaching a point at my understanding of the lore which wasn't really advancing much further, and I thought it would be nice to like start looking at this stuff on my own. But rather than like doing it on my own, I figured it would probably be easier to like share some of my perspectives on the fly, because it's really, really difficult trying to write a script in such a way that it's going to be accessible for a person who's like never looked at any other of my videos, and be coherent enough and in-depth enough to keep such a person entertained and interested all the way through. It is just so mind-bogglingly difficult that my gold and silver video script literally took 2 months to write, and I'm very proud of it because it answers what I think are a lot of like fundamental questions about the mechanics of Elden Ring to a degree. But with that being said, I still think it has an issue of not being highly accessible to somebody who's completely unfamiliar with the lore, which isn't the worst thing in the world. I do think it's still a very accessible video for the most part, but I tend to be a lot more of a specialist than a generalist, and trying to make generalist style videos is not my strong point, just because of what I would compare like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like once you know as much as you know, it's kind of hard to gauge how much somebody else doesn't know about your field of specialty, which I mean kind of sounds like a bit vain. I can admit that, but I mean it's kind of true, because like, not to like pick on anybody in chat by any means, but there will be some like very fundamentally basic questions that get asked from time to time, which take me back a little bit, because I have to remember, oh yeah, somebody doesn't necessarily remember, like 60 plus 70, 75% of the descriptions off the top of the head. So they just might not have all of the context to get a more full understanding of any given subject at a time. So anyway, that was quite a huge tangent. I'll catch up with the chat a little bit more, and then I'll have to keep going, because there's always a lot to talk about with the SMO videos, and I don't think we're going to get to the second video on schedule for tonight. Hey Scar and Meow, welcome back in. You got a bit lost, now you're here? Welcome in, nice to have you again. Yeah, as Scaleezy says, it's a lot harder to definitively say why background game assets are in the game versus written statements and dialogue. And yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm very reticent to discuss a lot of the visual assets, because so much has been reused from previous games that I don't know how much is from FromSoft directly versus assets that they've bought from third parties, because I've seen assets that they've bought from third parties used in previous games. So although the meme is that Miyazaki placed every blade of grass individually, I don't quite think that's the truth. Okay. Thank you guys for all the questions. I appreciate that. Now we'll go back to the video.
This would take a long time to fully explain once again, as I've done it several times throughout my videos, and so I will go through my reasoning as fast as possible, so not to distract from the subject at hand. Firstly, the Liurnian Wars are not mentioned in Godfrey's armour set as one of his great conquests, nor is he even mentioned to have taken place in the Liurnian Wars. It's all Radagon, and this implies to me that this is deep into his reign as Elden Lord, a period where he is vowed to act more like a lord. Thus Radagon, a champion, is given command of the army. There is also the Barrier of Gold incantation, the description of which tells us that this was an incantation used specifically in the Liurnian Wars, by Erdtree forces. The casting sigil of this incantation is the Celtic knot-looking version of the Erdtree, the sigil still worn by modern Erdtree knights, again suggesting this war was waged at a time when Erdtree society had been allowed to mature.
And that's kind of one of my favorite details about like the way that FromSoft will use environmental storytelling in their games, that because this sigil is not the ancient Erdtree sigil, it indicates that this is kind of later in the timeline, which is nice that we do have this hint, but it's also a little bit vexing that this is pretty much the only hint that we get as far the placement of the Liurnian Wars in the timeline.
This war was waged at a time when Erdtree society had been allowed to mature. I also ascribe to the theory purported by Tarnished Archaeologist, wherein you can trace the evolution of Erdtree culture and history through the different classes of Erdtree miracles. If you weren't aware, there are three classes of incantations associated with the Golden Order and the Erdtree, and they apply an evolution of changing beliefs under the same system. These incantation categories are the Ancient Erdtree incantations, which include any to do with the Age of the Crucible or the Age of Plenty. Then there is the categorization of Erdtree worship, which is what Barrier of Gold falls under. And then finally there is the Golden Order fundamentalists. And so given that the Ancient Erdtree incantations represent the Age of Plenty and the Age of the Crucible, this must be the beginning of Erdtree culture. On the other side, we have the Golden Order fundamentalist incantations, which are of course associated with Radagon's second Elden Lord's reign, so this is near the end of the timeline. And so in the middle, we have the Erdtree worship incantations, to which Barrier of Gold belongs. And again, to me, this is strong evidence that the Liurnian Wars happened in the mid-period of Erdtree rule. I hope that makes sense, and if you want a deeper look at these ideas, I would recommend Tarnished Archaeologist's Creeds of the Erdtree video, from where I get this theory.
Well, I agree with pretty much what Smotown was saying here. I will say that I have many major irreconcilable issues with that video in particular, and it is one of the very few that I've disliked on the channel for, I think, a lot of textual errors based in the game. But anyway, Samoa hasn't really come into any big errors here right now, so just wanted to give a little bit of a counterbalance point of view.
So let us return to the event of the Liurnian War itself, which we can therefore assume happened at the height of both the Erdtree and Liurnia's power. While the Erdtree forces were clearly going to be the dominant military force in the lands between, as we've discussed already, the Liurnian army was able to fight them to a standstill over two conflicts. We learn of this via the sword monument that details the Second War, which reads, "The Second Liurnian War. No victory for the Golden, nor for the Moon. No prize but atonement, the birth of a vow." We can imagine the Carians were able to hold back the much larger Erdtree armies through a few distinct advantages. Renala herself, who at this stage will have been the most powerful sorcerer in the lands between, the elite order of Carian knights and other oath-bound allies, and finally the defensive advantage. It wasn't one-sided, of course. Radagon from the Erdtree armies in particular is noted to have covered himself in glory during these conflicts, as the sword monument for the First War states, "The First Liurnian War, Radagon's glory burns as red as his hair." And so while we don't get any clear picture about the conflicts in this war, it was clearly a fearsome war between two kingdoms at the height of their power.
Hey Tony Pepperoni, Chimera, nice to see both of you again. Meow says, they're certain that Miyazaki does do environmental storytelling and watches the progress of making the map and gives them tips or recommendations so the map makers can fulfill environmental storytelling. So I think there is a little bit of that as well. I mean, there's definitely a lot of environmental storytelling throughout all of their games. We were watching the top 10 trolls of From Software games yesterday on stream, and our guy was talking about how he got into Sen's Fortress and he went into the elevator and wasn't paying that much attention and then got slammed into the ceiling that had a bunch of spikes coming out of it. And then he died, but when he came back to the area, he noticed that there's like a giant pool of blood at the base of the elevator, and he's like, how did I miss that? And so yeah, they definitely do a lot of environmental storytelling. So I wasn't trying to say that that environmental storytelling wasn't or isn't part of the games, but it's curious how much of the environmental storytelling is a carefully crafted experience, because there are certainly moments like that with the pools of blood and the mimics breathing and whatnot, but there's also a copious amount of asset reuse throughout all of their games, and that kind of makes it harder to discern what is meant to be significant versus what was placed out of convenience. Environmental storytelling is stupid. Okay.
It speaks to the power and prestige of Caria and its royal house, given it was able to hold off this mighty empire by itself. Of course, Radagon and Renala would eventually make peace that was secured through marriage.
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Renala. The order of the Erdtree and the fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the wounds of war forgiven.
Before we go any further, there is something really interesting in this dialogue. Miriel states that the order of the Erdtree and the fate of the moon were conjoined. The fact he specifically talks about fate being conjoined with order is fascinating to me. It makes me rethink some of my prior assumptions. The telescope item description reads as follows. During the age of the Erdtree, Carian astrology withered on the vine. The fate once writ in the night skies had been fettered by the Golden Order. I had always assumed that this was a reference to Radagon halting the movement of the stars and arresting their movement, as we do know this does affect the fate of the Carians, and we actually have to kill him in order to restart fate and free up Ranni's fate. However, from this dialogue with Miriel, of order and fate being conjoined, makes me think that this union was something more than just a marriage between Renala and Radagon, that fate was also married to order, and that somehow it was restricted by order being imposed upon it. Astrology is really important.
So this is something that I bring up from time to time, but it bears repeating here, in that the Japanese nameplate for Radagon of the Golden Order, I guess I should show it on screen. Let me pull it up. Radagon of... So for Radagon of the Golden Order, we get Olgon Ritsu, which means Golden Order, comma, Radagon. So the of the Golden Order thing, or sorry, the of the thing isn't necessarily in the Japanese. So although it can be understood to be something to the effect of Radagon of the Golden Order, it can also be understood as Golden Order, comma, Radagon, which could imply that Radagon himself is the Golden Order, which it's kind of hard to wrap one's head around, that he's kind of a living embodiment of order itself. But then again, he kind of is a pseudo vessel for the Elden Ring, which kind of houses order as well. So it does make some sense. And if you do view Radagon as a kind of a vessel or incarnation or avatar of the Golden Order, then him marrying Renala could tie into these descriptions the dialogue of Miriel, in that the order of the Erdtree could have been conjoined with the fate of the moon. And I do think it is very relevant that the moon is tied to fate, and this implies to me that the Carian astrology and the fate of the moon and the fate in the night sky was not actually governed by that of the Elden Ring until after Radagon marries Renala and, fetters it both literally and maybe figuratively figuratively and or maybe literally, due to the great rune that he uses, which I believe he kind of manufactured after studying the Carian sorceries. And I bring this up quite often in the streams, just the sigils that you can find on the Rennala the Carian barriers and the like web of weird style thorns on the Erd tree. So Raya. One second here, let me pull this up. So like I say, I think he took like this lattice design here and then put it into his Elden rune. So I don't really feel like I need to show that, so I'll just truncate things for once and move on. Iman asks, does that mean Radagon is in essence America? I believe so, yes. Or were you asking a mimic? True Connoisseur wishes we understood more of what it meant for the moon's fate to be reconciled and conquered by the Erd Tree. There's something metaphysical going on there that's really vague and obtuse. So, I guess to give a little bit more context as to some of my ideas, and this is going to be highly contentious in the community at large, and, you know, kind of based on speculation on my part, is that the moon guiding fate could potentially be related to something like destined death, because as far as destiny and fate go, they're the same character in Japanese. Unmei, or characters in Japanese, the same word in Japanese, unmei. So destined death is unmei no shi, whereas like the fate used in the night sky is just unmei. So are they actually meant to be connected? Maybe. We're never ever really given a clear answer as to the how and why of it, but that's just kind of how FromSoft tends to roll in their games. So, if Radagon controlled or gained control of the moon and the fate in the night sky through Renala, would that have allowed them to remove the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring? Maybe. I tend to be of the opinion that I don't think the Rune of Death was removed upon the beginning of Godfrey's reign, and I am of the opinion it was removed at the beginning of Radagon's reign, which is going to be like my highly contentious thing, although I totally understand why people believe that the Rune of Death should have been removed with Godfrey. I just don't think it works out for a number of reasons. How do I feel about Radagon being a red glintstone? I wouldn't necessarily call him red glintstone specifically, but we were talking about this on the Discord a little bit earlier today, and I made a joke comment that's, you know, mostly kind of serious to Crunchy on one of his streams, that Radagon himself could be the Spear of Longinus, which is piercing Marika's side in the cutscene when we first see him. The connection between the moon and Destined Death makes a bit more sense of the Castle Soul Eclipse thing. And yeah, I think it can all tie together, and because I think it can all tie together, it just kind of makes things worse, because, you know, to kind of gesture down to my Pepe Sylvia Gideon Ofnir guy over here, it really feels like I'm pulling a Pepe Sylvia saying that everything's all connected, and it might turn out that nobody's really getting their mail. So yeah, it's just a pain to talk about it, because in order to talk about like one thing, you need to give the context of 5 other things, which need the context of 2 other things each. So it just becomes this heat map of absolute gobbledygook, just to make a point that is kind of built on a house of cards, figuratively speaking here.
Important to the Carians, and this is denoted by the fact the Carian preceptors seem to carry on the practices of their astrologer ancestry, and the fact that Renala was once herself an astrologer. And Selin's dialogue that we looked at earlier makes it clear how important fate is to the Carians. But perhaps it was at this moment, when fate was conjoined with order, that the fate of the Carians truly became restricted, maybe it is little surprise that Ranni despises the Golden Order so much and that she would strike out against them. Just something to think about when thinking about the wider consequences of this marriage. I really do love the lore significance of the Church of Vows. Miriel tells us that it was constructed at a specific point within Liurnia in order to have both sight of Rennala the Carian and the Erd Tree, symbolically looking at the moon and the tree, representing the union of the House of the Tree and the House of the Moon. After the church was constructed, the marriage was prefaced with an old Noxian custom, the cleansing of oneself with celestial dew. I do think it's important to analyse what happened here, as it isn't merely a symbolic gesture. There is actually a power to this ritual. I have discussed this already in this video and in more detail in my Nox video, but the Nox essentially experimented with alchemy. We know that stars are tied to fate, something expressed by the Amber Starlight Shard item description, and via Selen's dialogue on fate and the Carian family. And thus, to me, both the puppet drafts of the Nox and the Celestial Dew likely manipulate fate latent within the stars. For the puppet drafts, they shackle the fate of those who imbibe it, and in the case of the Celestial Dew, fate is rewritten, animosity forgotten. For example, if I attacked Blythe and killed him to get a dialogue for my lore video, he would resurrect and permanently be aggroed at me. However, if I cleanse myself with Celestial Dew, it's like he resets, almost as if he has forgotten our previous conflict. Our fate has been realigned, and this enmity no longer exists. I wonder if this contributed to how strongly Renala felt about Radagon. It is clear that the relationship was initially political. In real history, often a pact of peace was solidified between kingdoms with a marriage between the houses.
So I kind of mentioned this, I think, yesterday's stream or the day before, because we've kind of talked about this topic a lot recently, but I have wondered whether or not Radagon being cleansed by the Celestial Dew affected him in unforeseen ways because of his like dual nature with Marika and whatnot. And I've wondered if that like kind of allowed him to be broken out of a spell, and that might have been like the moment where he kind of became his own person. But obviously we don't really have a lot to support that at all, and that's just kind of an idea that I've had. Like, is this the moment where he gained like actual independence from Marika? Because there is the weird dualism between Marika and Radagon that is woefully underexplored. And so if there ever was a moment to explain when Radagon like really like became separate from her, I think this would be a likely source of or candidate for that time. So a Codman said, you like the approach of using the moon as destiny? You should look into that more, because you see Celestial Dew is connected to Mana Celeste. So just to give a little bit more context about the moon and fate thing. So I don't necessarily think the moon controls fate directly. I do think it's likely that fate is found in the stars in the night sky, but if the moon can guide the stars and the stars govern fate, then the moon can kind of control fate in a roundabout manner, perhaps, which might have been of vital importance to Radagon and Marika in terms of them they're trying to control both heaven and earth, which is why I think it's important that Marika learned lunar sorcery specifically, because there are a bunch of unresolved questions about Marika's ties to the Nox cities and their use of sorceries. So I think that Renala had a unique form of magic is kind of paramount to understanding both Marika and or Radagon's motivations for their union with Renala. That's an interesting idea. Thank you. So Skymeow asks, if the Elden Ring determines the natural order, is it possible removing destined death removes death from the lands between, and why we have free destined death before, and why we have to free destined death before deleting Marika and Radagon? So, the whole needing to free Destined Death to deal with Marika and Radagon is an interesting thing, because if Radagon wasn't trying to block off the Erdtree, would we have been able to just burn it down with the Flame of Ruin? Maybe. I don't necessarily know. It's possible the Flame of Ruin could have been I'm failing to find the proper word. So let's just say, like, metaphorically, like, castrated, where it just couldn't do it because, like, its source of power was diminished due to Destined Death not being a thing anymore. So yeah, that part at the very least is questionable. And then what was the first part of your question again? If the Elden Ring, yeah, I know you're asking. Yeah, I think I answered it, but yeah, maybe it's just a little bit unsatisfactory, unfortunately. Crunchy says the Flame of Ruin burns the Erdtree, but the Erdtree can't die because death doesn't work. Yes, but it is questionable how much of Destined Death really influences things, because it's been fragmented due to Ranni's actions. Like, I don't disagree with what you say exactly. So somebody made a really funny image a while back, and I've definitely seen it on Crunchy server. I don't think I have it. Maybe Assailant LF is the one who made it, where it says something like, Black Flame is related to Destined Death, but it's not Destined Death, which is related to Ghost Flame, which is not Destined Death. And so, like, we've got all these different kinds of flames, which are kind of related to each other, but also not, and kind of individual things. Because I also forgot to mention the Flame of Ruin. So they're kind of all contingent upon Destined Death, it seems, to some degree. But yeah. So at the very least, like, the Flame of Ruin is part of the prophecy of the Erdtree, according to, like, the prophets that see the Flame of Ruin in the Erdtree. So whether or not that has any bearing on Destined Death is up for interpretation. But as Crunchy says, it could be necessary to actually, like, kill the Erdtree so that way we could become Elden Lord. But yeah. If Radagon let us in, Marika would not be able to die. After all, in Ranni's ending and the Frenzy Flame ending, Marika dies. That's an interesting way of looking at it, because yeah, I don't know. So it depends. Like, it might be necessary to kill the Elden Beast, which would kind of be part of Marika's will to an extent. So it's just all very convenient sometimes. All right, I'm gonna go back to the video now.
Elden Ring is clearly no different. However, despite this, it is clear that there was some genuine affection between the two. Miriel describes how Radagon declared his love for the beautiful Full Moon Queen, and then Renala's armor set tells us how much she was devastated by him leaving her. So she must truly have been in love with him. But we will return to the collapse of the marriage at the end of this video.
In time for me to stop it after 15 seconds. So, Albigade, welcome back to the stream. You kind of reminded me of something with your comment, and anyway, your comment was, this made you think that maybe the metaphorical meaning of the Flame of Ruin being unextinguishable is that, well, it can be stopped from killing by sealing death, it can still destroy civilization, if that makes sense. So this is going to be some very heavy speculation, headcanon, that I don't necessarily fully believe, but it's just been an idea that I've had that might be worth sharing, is that it might be the case that the Flame of Ruin, like many other things in Elden Ring, could have a dual nature, in that the Flame of Ruin might provide life as well as destruction, which, you know, seems very counterintuitive at first, I'll admit. But my rationale for that is that when Marika encounters the Flame of Ruin and realizes that it can never be put out, she curses the last trifling giant up in the mountaintops with a curse of essentially eternal life. So, while it's a common thought that the reason that Marika and Godfrey could have gone to war with the fire giant is to seal the flame of ruin so that way the Erdtree couldn't die, I wonder if part of sealing the flame of ruin could be the exact same thing which allows the Erdtree to flourish for so long, because the flame of ruin might be because it's eternal in a certain sense. So removing it might only be one part of the story, but if you think of the Erdtree as a power conduit, it might be that it is sealing the source of its power within it, so that way it's not being stolen by others. Now, again, that is some very heavy conjecture and speculation on my part, and there isn't really a lot to support it other than the fact that the flame of ruin can never be extinguished, and that the fire giant was made to live eternally. And there is some other through lines in how the adherents of the Erdtree in the form of the Erdtree Guardians would be granted a form of eternal life due after their death and rebirth as Erdtree Guardians, they say. Although, of course, after the shattering, their pacts may have been severed, hence the blooming red flowers on some of their backs and whatnot. And then True Connoisseur said, they're not sure Marika is properly alive in the Erdtree. She seems fully dormant in a kind of limbo state. Yeah, I kind of agree with that, which is what I was thinking about in relation to the other comment. And then in the middle of those thoughts, I was like, well, you might still need Destined Death released to kill, like, the Elden Beast. But, yeah, anyway. Good comment there. Scar Meow says, Death Right, Death Blight, and Destined Death are all different types of death magic. Whilst the Black Flame was created using a piece of Destined Death that was stolen by the Glowmide Queen, so it makes sense. So that part, what you just said there, is not necessarily in the text, that the Glowmide Queen stole any part of Destined Death. So I would kind of just disagree with that, or just say that there isn't quite enough support for that statement on its own. Albigade thinks it makes sense because when the Elden Ring shatters, the Erdtree releases its seeds. There are many big trees which only release their seeds when in a forest fire. True. Pyrophytes, I believe they're called. Dr. Zayas says, they think it might be more of a duality of creation and destruction. The giants and trolls invented smithing after all. Yeah, so that's kind of what I feel about it. At least for now, I'm fine if it goes one way or the other, but I haven't really heard anybody else talk about it that way. And I guess it's a little bit of a surprise. Black Flame is the same power as Destined Death, albeit weaker, which is why Ranni could die, but not powerful enough to burn the Erdtree. So, part of the reason Black Flame may be the way that it is because of the sealing of Destined Death, or the removal of Destined Death. So when the Glowmide Queen controlled Black Flame, it definitely had a stronger power, but yeah, how much of that is supposed to have been a different thing from Destined Death is also up for debate. Alright. I would love to keep reading some more of these comments, but I do need to get through the rest of the video.
For now, I want to talk about the marriage itself, as one of the more interesting points of lore within the entire story of Elden Ring comes up within their marriage. And this is the implication that Renala knew the truth of Radagon's identity, that he is Marika. I have discussed this in huge detail before, specifically in my Radagon lore video, which I would refer you to, but I believe that Radagon was already Marika at the time of his marriage to Renala. And again, my full thesis on that is in my Radagon video. However, for the purposes of this video, the main item of relevance is the Mask of Confidence, worn by the Carian preceptors. It reads the following.
Yeah, I'm
Mask
kind of
with
the
mouth
same
sewn
mind here.
shut with gold thread. When Radagon married Renala, he ordered the Carian magic preceptors to don these masks, to make it clear that all of their matters were to be kept strictly private. So I know others have argued that the preceptors are just keeping matters of state private. But come on, when we are talking about Radagon, there really is only one elephant in the room when we are talking about secrets. There's also the fact that when Radagon left Renala, he left her a fragment of the Elden Ring, the Amber Egg, as a parting gift. How would a mere champion gain access to the Elden Ring?
And so, while many people believe it to be a parting gift, it's not actually clear if it was a parting gift. It's just that when he left her, she was left cradling the Amber Egg. So I definitely understand why people think it's a parting gift, but it is never made explicit, which is, always fun.
Take one of its runes. Well, the answer is he couldn't, unless he was also Marika, the god of the age, who bore the Elden Ring. So it's quite interesting that the masks of the preceptors are not part of their original outfit. Rather, it's an affectation born of the Carian's association with the Erdtree royalty. It means that Celivis was also potentially privy to the greatest secret of an era. Just a nice little consideration. This also means that when Radagon and Renala had children, they are true demigods, not just by virtue of Radagon's later marriage, where they became stepchildren.
Crunchy asks, does it even say she was cradling it when he left her? You thought Gideon just says she's cradling it now. I'm pretty confident that comes from Muriel's dialogue, which, let's go ahead and look. Cradling. In the end, Lady Renala was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, I looked at this like the other day. So there is no really, substantial difference between the English and the Japanese here. But yeah, this is definitely Muriel's dialogue, the great and beautiful full moon witch. So, yeah. Let me go back.
Rykard and Radagon's great runes say that they became demigods when they became the stepchildren of Marika through their father's second marriage. However, I just see this as a political excuse to cover the real truth, that they were actually demigods by virtue of their birth.
Yeah, that's one of those lines in the game that just really, really annoys me because it implies that they were not demigods beforehand, and because I'm pretty confident, what item description is that?
Real truth.
I think it's their great runes, isn't it? Because it's not written as hearsay, that's one of those ones where I feel like I have to just take it at face value here. Let me pull it up. Oh, I'm looking at the 1.0 text. That does not help me, because there's barely any descriptions there. Who became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's union with Queen Marika. Oh, right. So, with this description here, in both languages, it doesn't really use... It doesn't really use hearsay or anything like that. One of the more annoying things about this is that it uses the kanji gaiseki, which I talk about a lot on my video about Seath essentially being Gwyn's father in Dark Souls. Not clickbait, but it's clickbait. So when I say Seath is Gwyn's dad, in a certain sense, it's kind of true, because the way that Seath is described as a duke is that he is a gaiseki, which taken the two characters on their own, you have the character for outer and then the character for family relative, but you might take that to mean an outside relative or an extended family member on a surface glance, but it actually has more meaning to be as this kind of crappy little definition here shows you, is a maternal relative, which means that they became demigods through their mother's side, essentially, of the family, which doesn't make a lot of sense, But hold on, let me reread this. Okay, yeah. So when Radagon and Marika became married, the two children became demigods through their through the maternal side of their family, which in this case is a reference to Marika. So it's supposed to be like the connection between their divinity comes from Marika. So we have the weird case of trying to consider whether like how much of Radagon is Radagon and how much of Radagon is America. And through other items like Millennia's Great Rune, it's kind of clear that they're both the same person because it's kind of written that way. But, or no, I'm thinking of the Remembrance of the Rock Goddess, not the rune itself. This one is a little bit different and shows that demigodhood relates to America more so than Radagon, which in a certain sense does make sense because Radagon is yet to be a god, and it's really the proximity to America which like determines that factor, I guess. So yeah, I just absolutely kind of hate this description because it doesn't use anything like hearsay where I could use mental gymnastics to get out of it. Because in my mind, I agree with Smowtown that I do believe Rykard and Radon should have been demigods before that because, you know, the children of Radagon. But there is the strong possibility that even though they are hereditarily related to America, the whole idea of what a demigod is could be like a social institution, which I feel like I've been saying this constantly. It's just I don't want to say like unfortunate, but it's just like those are the facts, Jack. I don't know. I'm like losing my mind at this late time. Scar is getting tea. Elden Beast is a physical body. Rad's America. They weren't demigods because of the celestial dew, maybe? That's an interesting thought, and maybe, but so yeah, that could kind of make sense in a way that you could potentially make an argument that Radagon was broken off from America due to the celestial dew until he kind of, you know, rejoins her on his return to Leyndell. So, well, it's not ideal. I do think that is enough mental gymnastics to potentially come up with a plausible explanation. Definitely not my favorite way to operate, but yeah, I think that works, Crunchy. Yeah, so I will kudos to you and tip my hat to that. Albigade wonders if demigod stepchildren was a concept that stayed from the original Gurm concept because it's politically interesting as the element of the overall tensions between the Carians and the varied golden... It looks like your comment got cut off. Okay. So yeah, like demigod could be a status thing because even Godfrey is technically called a demigod. So it isn't necessarily a hereditary thing, just to be fair. So political. And if like Radagon is not America, he doesn't necessarily have like the political authority to instate demigods. So in a certain sense, it does work, but it's just, it takes a lot of work to make it work. And I kind of hate it.
However, I just see this as a political excuse to cover the real truth, that they were actually demigods by virtue of their birth. During the marriage between Renala and Radagon, we can assume that this was a happy time for both. Renala being blessed with her different children, and grooming Ranni to be her successor, and eventually they would relocate closer to the shores of Liurnia into Carian Manor, as we've discussed before, in an attempt not only to have a better, more strategic location, but also to strengthen the ties between these two kingdoms, which had now been married into one another. And as prosperous as we can imagine this period to be, it obviously wasn't meant to last. In this chapter, I do want to focus on the collapse of the Carian household, and I won't be covering the children of Renala that much, as I already have full hour-long videos on Rykard, Radon and Ranni, and I will link those below. However, in the context of the collapse of the house, I do think it's important that we cover some of Ranni's lore. As I said in the previous chapter, I assume that Ranni's meeting with the Dark Moon when she was young happened when Renala and Radagon were still together. Because after Radagon leaves Renala,
Yeah, I agree. I probably shouldn't cut him off. Okay.
it appears that she's completely broken, and thus I would think incapable of introducing her to her Dark Moon. I would also assume that Ranni meeting the Snowy Crone would take place after Radagon and Renala's marriage fell apart, and I think this for a couple of reasons. Firstly,
So that's an interesting perspective that I hadn't quite considered. But yeah, maybe that could make sense. I would need to think about that more. That the Snow Crone could have showed up once Renala got brokenhearted. Huh. I kind of like it.
let's look at two bits of lore that cover this facet of the story. Firstly, the Snow Witch set, which reads, once worn by the Snowy Crone, who the young Ranni encountered deep in the woods. She was a witch and well versed in cold sorceries. It is said that the doll that houses Ranni's soul was modelled after her. That old witch was Ranni's secret mentor. And now let's look at the description of the freezing mist spell, which reads, sorcery said to have been used by the old Snow Witch. The Snowy Crone taught the young Ranni to fear the dark moon, as she imparted her cold sorcery.
All right, that's why I never thought about it that way. Because if Ranni learned about the moon from Renala, but the Snow Crone taught her to fear the dark moon, I interpreted that Ranni kind of figured out her dark moon through Renala's full moon. But I guess that doesn't necessarily have to work that way. She could have been taught the full moon and then through the Snow Crone refined her ideas. Interesting. Okay. I can see where he might be coming from here.
So this mysterious witch became Ranni's mentor, and part of my reasoning for it taking place after Renala's fall is because maybe Ranni needed a new mentor, a new mother figure. It is clear that this woman is important to Ranni, considering she completely models her new form after this figure. Perhaps this was because this Snowy Crone was there for Ranni when she needed someone, when she needed some guidance. Secondly, the freezing mist description tells us that it was this Snowy Crone who taught Ranni more about the secrets of the Dark Moon. Again, this suggests to me that this took place sometime after that initial meeting with the Dark Moon, organised by Renala. It's just that this Snowy Crone taught her the deeper secrets of the occult and the Dark Moon. Perhaps the fall of Ranni's house, her father's abandonment of her mother in favour of the Erdtree Order, is what led Ranni to choose a different path, resenting the Erdtree Order and all that it stood for. After learning the secrets of the Dark Moon, she would pledge herself to the Age of Stars, and set herself on a path which would have lasting consequences for the lands between. But with that covered, we now need to talk about the main event that really heralded the end of the Carian house as a serious power, Radagon's departure. We know from Miriel that Radagon's departure left Renala essentially devastated.
The great and beautiful full moon witch. Sadly, her heart was broken when Lord Radagon left her. And then, when the Academy rebelled against the Royals, she was locked away in the Grand Library. In the end, Lady Renala was left alone, cradling the amber egg.
That transition between the car or like the Blythe armor to Dung Eater, that's something.
Lord Radagon bequeathed her. Now she devotes herself to it through forbidden rite, the grim art of reincarnation. You would do well to remember, severing a vow, strongest of bonds, has consequences ever more dire.
Indeed, this is how we see Renala now, broken, kept in a sort of delusional slumber by the lullabies of her sweetings. As to why she creates such beings, it is again up to speculation. There's the possibility it is just loneliness, and that creating these beings gives her comfort, and she's just using the last tool that her beloved Radagon gave her, especially when you consider it is their lullaby that keeps her suspended in this slumber, and us breaking this slumber is what causes Ranni to intervene in the first place.
So I think Jack as a mimic may have said something in the Discord today, but I don't quite remember what it was, and he didn't like phrase it this way, but now I'm like thinking about the fact that junior scholars do try to put Renala back to sleep, and Ranni says nobody may disturb her slumber. So, if slumber is as oblivion to the Sweetings, could the goal be that by sleeping so much, Renala seeks oblivion or the ability to forget about Radagon? That could make a lot of sense in a lot of ways, that sleep is an escape, but it would also be kind of tragic if the reason why Renala couldn't forget about Radagon and whatnot is because of the egg he actually left her, because it perfects her own rebirth. Not that I think she's actually like rebirthing herself, but there's like a perfection to it which would not affect her the same way that it could affect all of the like juvenile scholars. So I don't like fully believe that, but I'm just like kind of like thinking that through out loud right here. And there's parts of that idea that I like. So I don't know how about you guys in the chat feel about that. So Dr. Zayas asks, does the Japanese name for the snowy crone have the same connotations of age as in English? Yeah, I'm pretty sure they use Baba, like the Baba Yaga type thing. Which is Baba Yaga technically Russian? Anyway, I'm pretty sure like in Russian and Japanese, like Baba is just like a derogatory like word for an older woman. I know in like Bloodborne, when Eileen calls herself a hag, it's the same thing. It's like Baba. Baba Yaga is Slavic. Okay. Thank you, Stella. Let me actually look at that. Snow crone. It might just be witch, but... Oh, no. This is different. I was misremembering then. So the first character is Ro, as in like old, and then it's just like witch. So they just called her the old witch. There you go. Good question.
Of course, Radagon's departure had more radical consequences than just breaking Renala's heart. It essentially led to the entire collapse of the Carian Royal Family. Up until this point, and as should be made clear by this video by this point, the Carian Royal Family's power was based around Renala, not only through her unique and powerful sorceries, but through her general charisma and statesmanship. But with her basically out of action, enemies would now finally be able to act and bring down the hold that the Carians had over Liurnia. And we learn about the Carians essentially rebelling against Renala via her own robes, which read the following. When Renala, head of both the Academy of Caria and the Carian Royal Family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him, and then those at the Academy realised that Renala was no champion at all. In short, it was a moment of weakness that was exploited by those at the Academy, a chance to shake off her rule. Here was the powerful ruler that had dominated Liurnia and Caria for years, broken and weak, and so they locked her up in the Academy. But even with Renala out of the picture, the Carian Royal Family had powerful retainers at their command, something we've already looked at, and so the Carians would need some muscle, and this is where the Cuckoos come in. The relationship between Caria and their soldiery, the Cuckoos, is described by the Caria soldier Ash, which reads the following. The soldiers of Caria were also known as the Cuckoos. They were given free rein by the Academy to wage war as they pleased, and they were infamous for their rapacious ways. The Academy had a sort of hands-off approach to controlling their armed forces. Indeed, this may be due to the fact that the relationship between the Academy and the Cuckoos was closer to that of a mercenary force rather than fealty. The scholar
And I don't remember what video pointed it out, but they made a really good observation that there's a strong possibility that the Cuckoo Knights could have been installed by Radagon and or like America, essentially to partially destabilize the power of Lucaria, which makes a ton of sense. And if you have Cuckoo Knights, it kind of like fits in with the imagery that they could have like come from an outside kingdom to occupy the Lucarian nest there. And of course, the Cuckoo Knights armor set is more or less identical to all the other demigod children soldier armors. So It's not like a native Rennala the Carian armor either.
Scholar's armament spell reads the following.
Are they called cuckoos because they're all insane? I don't know why I never thought about it that way. No, so they have lucidity to prevent themselves from going insane. But no, the most likely explanation would be that it's like a specific kind of bird, which is associated with like the Nox and watching over the body and whatnot. And a cuckoo in real life, it will enter the nest of other birds. They will lay their egg in that nest, and then when the cuckoo egg hatches, that cuckoo bird will knock off all of the other eggs within that nest, so that way they get all of the nutrients that not Papa and not Mama Bird will bring that bird. So they just kind of like become like essentially parasites to other birds. So, yeah, that might have to like a lot to do with the whole Radagon thing, where he might come into Rennala the Carian, lay down his young to push out all competition, and then he just goes off and does his own thing. So, yeah. They don't call her Snowy at all in Japanese. I'm pretty sure they do at some points, but let me look a little bit more closely. No, Shibutai Majitu. Snowy Crone. But the old Snow Witch. Yeah, so Oita Yuki Majo. So in this one, it's just like the aged Snow Witch. And this one is in Frozen Armament. So most times they really just seem to call her the Old Witch. All right.
Taught to the Knights of the Cuckoo by the Academy as payment for their contract. So here we learn of a contract between the Rennala Carians and the Cuckoo soldiery. And as such they were given free rein to wage war against the Carians in any way they saw fit. A brutal war, we can assume, given the rapacious reputation of the marauding Cuckoo forces. However, we of course know the Carians are also brilliant strategists, and so aside from their powerful knights and dragons and trolls, they also unleashed the puppets against these rebellious upstarts. And we can see this actually still happening on the eastern side of Liurnia. Again, just another benefit of their ties to the Noxian people. However, as this war ended up in the siege of Carian Manor, we can assume that the Cuckoos overwhelmed the leaderless Carians, and they were held up in the Carian Manor. However, it was at this stage that the Carians were able to get a bit of a win, as the sword monument outside of Carian Manor reads the following. The resting place of the contemptible Cuckoos, lost in the siege of Carian Manor. Indeed, in a dialogue, E.G. confirms that the Knights of the Cuckoo were essentially slaughtered during the siege of Carian Manor, thanks to these magical traps, and no doubt a result of the defensive advantage that Carian Manor offered. Indeed, we still see Cuckoo soldiers being used by Pidia or by Celivis as puppets within the manor.
The funny thing is, just like a couple moments ago, I was thinking how weird and short-sighted it was for the Carians to build a kind of defensive manor when they kind of controlled the area at a time when they shouldn't have really had many enemies if they were part of like the Erdtree Empire, because, you know, they would have been a vassal state. But it turns out it's probably a smart thing to do, because then they stopped all the Cuckoos from attacking them, essentially. But anyway.
I can't imagine being captured by anyone worse than Celivis or Pidia, being forced to drink a puppet draft, and being their little toy marionettes forever. Yet despite this, the Carians' power was clearly broken during this war, as Liurnia is quite clearly controlled by the Cuckoos now, as evident by their tents over the majority of its territory. Renala is locked away, and any remaining Carian forces have either scattered or are penned up in Carian Manor. Indeed, dialogue from Rogier suggests that the Carians have been largely absent in the years past, only recently returning to the Carian Manor.
I have some idea of Ranni's potential whereabouts. There's a manor to the north of the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It is the familial home of the Carian Royals, from whom Ranni descends. There's been talk of the old royals' vassals gathering there in recent years. Ranni's whereabouts since the shattering are a well-kept secret. She hasn't been seen even once, but I suspect she might have returned to the manor in which she was born.
Suggesting that while the
So Dr. Zai says it's called brood parasitism. Okay, I thought the parasitism or parasitism was in there somewhere, but I couldn't remember the exact terminology, so thank you for that. And then, so one idea that kind of occurs to me now with the Cuckoos especially is that we know that the Cuckoo Knights themselves seem to be at war with the Albinaurics, and there is a line, I think, in the Albinauric staff which says, like, their natural enemy were the sorcerers after all, or something along those lines. But we never really get a hint of, like, Raya Lucaria itself being anti-Albinauric. So I wonder if there was a kind of hidden directive given to the Cuckoo Knights once they infiltrated Raya Lucaria to get rid of all the Albinaurics that they could have. Or if it's, just some, like, random ass prejudice, because Albinaurics are... Oh, actually, that would make a lot of sense. Because if Albinaurics are untouched by the Erdtree's grace, then it would make sense that, like, they would want to kill them if they were also given that directive from on high via, like, Radagon or something. And that would go with the whole, like, Cuckoo imagery of pushing out the young of other nests if the Albinaurics were more closely affiliated with Raya Lucaria. Although, of course, that is, like, heavy speculation. Might not be indicative of what we get in the final build of the game. I'm just kind of spitballing here. And why do the Raya Lucarians have so many caged cuckoos, though? So that way they could cultivate the bird poop for their glintstone specs.
Carians reaped a bloody toll during the siege of Carian Manor. This was essentially a victory for the Cuckoos. Rule under the Cuckoo in this area would be pretty brutal, especially for the Albinaurics. As the Albinauric pot reads, "The Knights of the Cuckoo do declare, behold thy defiled blood, unlike any humour that flows in..."
That description kind of always makes me laugh. "I do declare, behold thy defiled blood."
in our grand realm, suggesting that the Cuckoo don't even see the Albinaurics as human, a sentiment shared by many, as is described by the Albinauric Bloodclot, the greatest lore item in the game. This is of course a stark contrast compared to Carian rule. As we saw in the previous chapters, the Carians would welcome almost everyone into their service as long as they would take an oath. Indeed, we do have Albinaurics still serving the Carians now, and I can't help but wonder if the Albinaurics under Carian rule in Liurnia were able to live in peace or relative harmony, and it is only recently under the rule of the Cuckoos and Raya Lucaria that they've begun to be hunted. The description of the Albinauric Silver Shield suggests that their main enemies are indeed sorcerers, suggesting they are often at odds with the Raya Lucarians and their Cuckoo mercenaries. Indeed, armed bands of Albinauric second generations now control the area around Raya Lucaria, where Academy Town used to be. And again, I can't help but think that everything was more harmonious under the rule of the Carian Royal Family, and its collapse has had disastrous consequences for the unity of Liurnia, making it a very unstable region, made only more unstable by the fire monks who have recently come down, searching for the Thief of Fire, seeing their mission as paramount beyond any idea of nationality or sovereignty, and have thus occupied large swathes of Liurnia as well. I think it's fair to say that the unity of Liurnia has certainly receded. And indeed, this might be the greatest legacy of the Carians, is seeing how bad it is now in Liurnia. We can only imagine how strong and prosperous a nation it must have been to be able to resist the advancing Erdtree Empire, and how unified and strong it must have been under Renala in her heyday. Ultimately, this is all that's left of the Carian dynasty of old, their queen locked up and broken, their previous holdings broken and abandoned. The future of the Carians lie with Ranni, and while the splendour of the family is long since past, they may yet reach new heights, but it's clear they will never be what they once were. And having studied the Carians for this video and understanding how they bound an entire region of the map together through ideals of oaths and loyalty, it makes the fractured and divided state of Liurnia now all the more interesting. And while we are often blinded by the glory of the Erdtree royalty and their gods, it is actually the Carians who really showed the lands between what it means to be noble. Thanks, guys.
So I think that's a really good ending to a trash video that tries to suggest that somehow an Albinauric blood clot is better than gold-tinged excrement or soap. Hell no. No, but in all seriousness, I did enjoy that video quite a bit, and kind of impressed with the kind of final thesis statement of talking about the unity present in the Carians, which I do think is pretty overlooked by many for the most part, maybe myself included in that.
My take on the Carian Royal Family, a mighty house with loyal retainers that is ultimately crumbled into nothing. What are your thoughts on the Carian Royal Family? Was there anything you think I missed, or anything you disagreed with? Please let me know in the comments below, as I do always love a good lore discussion. Otherwise, also let me know what you'd like me to cover next in my lore videos. I'm still planning to cover Elden Ring, but also Bloodborne and Dark Souls, so let me know if there's any subject that piques your interest. If you like this content and you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and liking this video, as it helps me out a ton. But until next time guys, I will see you in the shattered remains of Moonlight Altar. Take care and have a wonderful night.
Alrighty. Another bang up job by our buddy Smo. So let's go ahead and link this into the chat for you guys if you want to give him a like and or a sub if you have not. And yeah, that we had a lot of discussion coming out of a Smotown video. I kind of expected that this could happen, but I'm a little bit surprised at how much over the time we went, but which is perfectly fine. You guys are getting your content's worth. So, let's go ahead and leave him a comment telling him that he is dead wrong. Hey, I think you said the Albinauric blood clots are the greatest item in the game, but have you considered your flat out wrong, and it's really the gold tinged excrement and soap which ties the lore together? Anyway, things are heating up in the Elden Ring community. Not if it's a gold-tinged excrement. For better or worse, it stays exactly as it is. You're already subbed to him, but you don't have the patience to watch for an hour. Yeah, that's understandable. It's always difficult trying to condense videos to be shorter at times. Typically what I do is when I'm on my own and not streaming for an audience, I like to watch videos at twice the speed, because when I do that, I can convince myself, oh, instead of an hour video, it's only a half-hour video. And then when it's like a 10-minute video, I'm like, oh, it's only a 5-minute video. So it just becomes a bit more manageable. So, yeah. Of course, sometimes like it's not the best depending on how quickly the content creator speaks. So typically for things that are unscripted, I might only watch at like 1.5 times speed, because people tend to speak a bit more quickly when they are not reading from lines or trying to intentionally slow down for like a broader audience. Whoops. I'm an elitist fraud. Okay. Boop and soap holds the lore. It's very true, Boris, and welcome into the stream. Unfortunately, this is the end of the stream. We've gone over time. Cut nothing. Okay. So, Zayas, if you want all of the hours of the Elden Ring lore content, you could definitely watch Smotown's last 2 videos, which are compilations of the rest of his videos. which are like 11 and 13 hours respectively. Oh, for you. I hate the stupid like for you section. It's not for me. Anyway, so the last one is 13, 37, 37. So it's the lead it length as well as 1231. So 26 hours of lore content for you to consume. That's more than a day's worth. Or maybe you segment the video into multiple parts that complete the topic when whole. Yeah. You fell asleep to the 12-hour video? Nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's still engagement as far as those content creators are concerned. Just hopefully you don't get one of those ads to jump scare you while you're falling asleep. Hashtag can't relate to that. All right, everybody. Well, that is going to be the conclusion for tonight's stream. I'll need to figure out what I want to put on schedule for tomorrow. And then I'm thinking I will start streaming Alundra on Friday. I might react to a video or two before that, but I'll need to like figure all of that stuff out. And if I do react to some videos, I might react to those videos on their own and then cut off the stream and then restart the stream, so that way it'll be like purely Alundra for people who like want to go through like the live archives and watch them, and only that like specifically. So if that stuff kind of appeals to you, that like segment the streams that way so you get like the more tailored content to what you want, let me know. If you don't really care and you don't mind if it's all together, also let me know. I don't expect to have nearly as much viewership for such an old game, but any viewership at all is welcome. I just want to share a game that I really enjoy and have probably forgotten almost everything about, so it'll be kind of akin to a blind playthrough. So anyway, stay tuned for more of that info when it becomes available. And remember, we'll be going live again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as per usual. So until then, stay safe, take care. Last Protagonist out.